Everybody, this is Emmy Thomas. I'm here with Don again and Daniel M. Ingram. Daniel, I'm going to ask you, what is it like to be you?
Well, thank you. It's great to be here. What is it like to be me? There's a lot of colors and textures and thoughts and senses of sort of a delight and a sense of anticipation and interest and curiosity. There's the senses of hands moving around and lips flapping and sounds coming out and pixels on the screen. And so this is a very sort of phenomenological answer, but my experience these days is, very immediate and phenomenological. So that's sort of the first answer. A more temporally expansive answer is that it's been fun. This is a fun phase of life. Like I get to do a lot of philanthropy and talk to a lot of cool people and help coordinate a lot of fun projects. It feels very meaningful these days. So it's a good phase. There is balanced with that, and it may be one of the reasons we connected. Like I've thought a lot about this sort of state of the world. Like there's this sort of weird juxtaposition of like my immediate experience, which is actually very delightful, and the fact that the world has some issues and is heading in some directions not all of which I like, to put it gently. And so there's this funny juxtaposition of this sense of I can get quite doomer in my moments, and yet my projects are fun and rewarding, and my experience is really nice. So
Hmm.
that's it's a funny thing to try to explain. I think probably in the same way that it's tricky to explain. I've listened to some of um, your podcast, Emmy, and like the Dark Fines podcast I was going through. And it's been really interesting, like to hear you explain like what it's like to be you. So I think this is going to be a fun set of conversations, and I'm looking forward to it. That's
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, I listened to your podcast as well. I'm super interested. It's always interesting to come across somebody who has such a unique experience of the world. And you're just like, wow, my eyes are opened at least as to the breadth and depth of the human experience. And as you were saying the thing about the world, do you know this song? It's like an old classic where in the middle it's like the world is a bad place. It is a
mm.
very bad place
I don't know if I know
to
that song,
live,
but
but I don't feel like dying. That's what the song, you guys can Google this lyric. I used to listen to that and be like, but it's a happy song. It's not a sad song. So when you were saying this juxtaposition, I was like, wow, classic kind of like 70s rock or whatever
yep.
lyrics. Well, Don, do you want to get started with the questions?
Yeah, gladly. Well, I also empathize with that to some extent because, like, I've had this intense special interest in the past half a year, maybe close to a year now, in personality disorders. And I've read Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha, like the first version, many years ago, and now reread it, read the latest version, and noticed certain like aspects of overlap there in psychodynamic theory. There's this idea that children in the first 2 years of their lives learn, like, first start out in sort of a state of psychosis, and where they just sort of have like there's this layer model. I think it's like Otto Kernberg who's like
Hmm.
mostly developed that, if I remember correctly, where the least organized layer is that of psychosis. Then there is like sort of the borderline layer in between that's also like separated in different sub levels, and then there's the neurotic level at the top that most people who don't have personality disorders are in, like these levels of personality functioning. And so children sort of start out on this lowest level and just sort of get in all sorts of sense experience, relatively like unsorted. And then over time, they just sort of learn that apparently there are certain sensual experiences that they can influence really strongly, and there are others that like can provide them with additional information and maybe some other criteria, and there are others that are very predictable, but also sort of like not very easy to influence, and so they start to make a distinction between sense experiences. They're coming more from something that they then conceive of as a self. And once they're coming from some external sources, and then they separate these external sources in some sort of dead objects and some live subjects, and make this connection between like they themselves having the self, and then also inferring that these subjects probably also have a similar experience from their perspective. And so they gradually learn this like interpretation of these sense signals through like the lens of the self and the other. And so there's this basic theory that is like related to object relations theory, and yeah, sort of very fundamental to some psychodynamic traditions. And that seemed like sort of the process that people are going through in the like path toward enlightenment or awakening, but sort of in reverse. And there I was thinking, okay, there is so much overlap here. Can we perhaps draw on some of these like Buddhist traditions to learn something about healing from certain cases where this process in childhood got interrupted at some point? So they are often thinking of personality disorders as arrests in this development of this interpretation of the of sensate experiences as a self, and it's like interrupted at some point when the development stopped. And so I was thinking perhaps children are sort of going backwards through a few of the jhanas, and they're most of them eventually reach sort of the zeroth jhana, as it were, and others get stuck somewhere. And there's this other interesting overlap that I noticed, that people with some people with psychopathy in particular, and some people with pathological narcissism experience very intense emotions of grandiosity, and then sometimes people with pathological narcissism in particular split on themselves and have like very intense experiences of self-loathing. And so I was wondering whether this arrest might be somewhere around the point of the arising and passing away, and perhaps sort of the Dark Knight territory, that perhaps they sort of cycle between those two, or are sort of like arrested somewhere in that vicinity. Um, and yeah, so first of all, the question about this is, um, does this make any sense to you? First of all, um, yeah, do you think this model resonates?
So it's funny you mentioned it. So I've got a friend here, Olivier, who's a phenomenologist that I work with in the work that I do of trying to help the clinical mainstream better understand the deep end of human experience and all its ramifications for mental health, healing, positive psychology, opportunities, perils, challenges, weird stuff. And one of the things we were literally just having a long discussion of yesterday is we were going through Piaget and Keegan. Piaget, for those who may not know, is like did a lot of child developmental psychology, where a lot of the stuff you're talking about of like object permanence and all these little milestones you learn when you learn to work with kids of like what's normal development. And then Keegan doing adult development stuff related to the sense of sort of identity and self-other stuff. And then we're also been looking at like Cook-Gruder, who starts to talk about like even more developmental stuff that can get into some interesting territory. I'm no expert on any of these models. I like have a sort of an slightly better than amateur layperson's understanding of them. But when it comes to meditation stuff, right, what we were just talking about is the fact that you learn object permanence and then you dissolve that when you do Vipassana practice, right? So you take a sort of radical, immediate empiricist stance with your sensate experience that any sensation not experienced at that moment does not exist. And then since the vast majority of the sensations that you think of as yourself don't exist in that moment either. Like, where can you find, you can't find all of your intellectual potential or all of your emotions or all of your history in any one moment. You find like the vaguest hint of a momentary phenomenological whisper of those if you're lucky. And so if you're very kind of immediate sensate, which is one of the things, Emmy, I would like to talk with you about at some point, like the sort of the self-avowed psychopath's experience of those kinds of phenomenal qualia of self, and like what is the kind of underlying structure of that. So let's leave some space for that, because that would be really interesting for me. Um, and so that you have to deconstruct a lot of the things you learned. You deconstruct object permanence, you deconstruct self-other, you deconstruct all of these things, and you can still do them. So it's like the sort of getting a little Ken Wilberian. You can, like, you know, transcend and include. So you can still do object relations, you can still do object permanence, but your immediate experience is also very straightforwardly utterly transient, utterly ephemeral. And so that's addressing the childhood development-y thing, where in some ways awakening is deconstructing in some like meta way or still functional way a lot of the early childhood lessons. And then the question of like getting stuck in certain stages, right? And how those relate to mental health. I mean, the stages of insight, for those listening not familiar, I'm just gonna, because you threw out a bunch of terms that I'm guessing a general audience is not gonna know about. So just to sort of like, you know, mirror what you, the audience, might be going through. Uh, um, so thinking about that and thinking, okay, the arising and passing away, I'm just going to define this as like, it's very complicated stage. I could talk for hours about it. I have on other podcasts, but it's basically a spiritual high, an opening, a conversion experience, and energetic stuff. Wow, like it kind of blows people's doors off, although it can be kind of quiet and subtle, might involve explosions of consciousness, very powerful dreams, a real shift in personality, a first like opening into increased levels of perceptual clarity about immediate experience. It can feel very rich, blissful, peaceful. For some people, also very jarring, shocking, like the lightning blasting through your spine can sometimes be kind of awful. So like there's a lot of things I could say about that. So that's just a very coarse summary. And then after that, in standard Buddhist meditation theory, you would get some kind of crash, right? So the stages are formally called dissolution, fear, misery, disgust, desire for deliverance, and reobservation. So reobservation is not very nice, like very descriptively named, but it's like, oh, like sort of an existential, claustrophobic, jarring, awful kind of a space. It's like it's as unmentally healthy as the stages of insight get. And then after those, if you're lucky, you get out to equanimity, this open, expansive, flowy, very natural, very clear, very inclusive, very equanimous, if you're, you know, and it can feel very nice, but in a less dramatic way than the A and P, which can feel very rapturous or even orgasmic or something very blissful for some. So these insight stages, like, yes, like it has been routinely speculated somehow in my insight circles that like maybe like narcissistic rage, where it becomes like so like contracted into oneself and yet out focused and kind of reactive, like has a reobservational sort of a component to it. Like there's a familiarity there of like, oh, that seems like very reobservation-y. Or disgust, like that's another one that can be like that. Like these bands of experience, or like mania looks very A and P. So if people who are prone to bipolar disorder, like a manic episode, like the creativity, the not sleeping, the sense of wow, I can do anything, or I am the, you know, next god emperor of the universe or whatever, can be very A and P. So, and then the sort of thinking about someone who might have those dual aspects sort of simultaneously in some complicated way. MEO's you were talking about shadow work in one of these podcasts, like where you have as a narcissist, you might have like the public face that like you project because you're scared people will see the private face that is like very real and kind of lizard brain and disgusting or embarrassing or shameful, something like that, right? And this one is very Dark Knight, and this one is very A and P. And so like, and I've routinely speculated that something of these kind of modes of cognition or these ways of being in the world have something to do with insight stages in some sort of like slightly like different kind of way. Like there's a part of me that might say kind of twisted or morphed or something, turned into something that's kind of like them, but also is kind of different. In the same way that like some manic episodes, like I have some friends who are very like bipolar, and they identify as bipolar, they can talk about it, and they have when they read the stages of insight, they have no resonance with it. They see nothing that looks like them except, yeah, when I'm manic, I don't sleep and I feel grandiose, but none of the energetics, none of the insights, none of the spirituality, none of that stuff. And they say when they get dark and depressed, yeah, but it's not existential in that kind of like, what is consciousness? Do I exist kind of way? It's just life sucks and they want to kill themselves or whatever. So like but then there are bipolar friends who like, when they're up in a manic episode, it has all these insighty qualities. And then when they're down in a depressive episode, it does have these complicated, do I exist as a sensate object? Like it has these sort of insighty qualities to it too. So like maybe what I call dual diagnosis, which is like they have both insight stages in pathology. And then it's interesting when I read descriptions or when I was listening to you, Emmy, talk about what it's like to be a psychopath. It is hard not to imagine that it has some kind of equanimity quality to it.
Hmm.
Right? This is a funny thing to say. And like people who like are traditionalists, the Orthodox people are going to be freaking out if they're listening to this. But I keep going, that kind of sounds like equanimity, because there's not this contraction into guilt or fear or whatever. The sense of self seems very thin or kind of fluid or liquid or transient. Like, why would you care about those things? Why would you be, worried with remorse or scared or something? So there is this funny sort of equanimity-ish like quality. And I think that's why like James Bond films, like James Bond is kind of a psychopath, or some these other like, these films of like these people who are just happen to be very, very good at killing people and don't seem to feel too bad about it. And yet they're sort of on the side of good. That'd be a fascinating conversation. I'm sure you must have talked about those before somewhere. But like, there's an equanimity-ish quality to that where reality just moves through and you're fine and it's kind of in flow and it's like, oh, whatever. Like, I don't know. It's just what's happening.
Yeah.
And that sort of self-acceptance. So, and then, yeah, so those are just kind of my first impressions and reactions to your statement. Sorry, that was kind of a long diatribe, but you put out a lot there, and hopefully that wasn't too long an answer.
Yeah.
Well, my question was kind of long too.
Had a lot of intro. I have like just a couple reflections
Mhm.
before we get to the next, unless Don, you have something
I would
to
actually
respond to.
be super interested in the two of you just sort of checking or like, I don't know, Daniel trying to like diagnose which stage of insight you are in or were in different phases of your life, try to get a bit of an overview. I think that would be really interesting.
Okay. And speaking just kind of to the preface, I guess, to your question of this idea, who is it? Who's the person that had this theory of like the top is neuroticism, and that's where most people are in terms of identification, and then the bottom is the chaos for babies.
So I've heard it associated with Otto Kernberg, like in
Kernberg.
particular this model of personality organization.
So I
I don't know whether
actually,
it was the first.
yeah,
Yeah, sorry.
I love that you have shared this with me. I'm gonna try to look it up and read more about it. It does basically seem to describe like what I think is reality, for me. And I feel like I must have been sort of stopped along this stage pretty early because I think my natural tendency and my comfort zone actually even is where I am just perceiving things not so much from a place of self, but from a place of I have influence over this or I don't have influence over that. And
Mm.
it's less that I think even I am different from you. I am like there's less even of a distinction that I am me, Jamie, and you are you, Daniel, and you, Don. It's less of that, and it's more like I don't control Don, I don't control Daniel. That is the way that I kind of experience uh my life, and that's the one that I'm most comfortable with. When I get further away on this Kernberg up and down, I get I can feel anxiety. I can be like I'm less comfortable with this. I would rather just keep things simple and kind of pure. And maybe it is because there's like this equanimous feel to it, where it's like, well, if you just understand that you're in the river, let's say, but you're a fish, but the river's acting, there are rocks, and you're just kind of this thing that's moving in the river. You're part of the river in a way. That's a lot how it feels. And I don't really have so much a sense of my own past history, especially in those moments, the closer I get to that. And I don't really have a sense of much of the future, except to the extent I know, hey, there's a rock ahead and, move to the left type things, a couple moves ahead, kind of like chess. It's like a future that feels disconnected because it's more just, like a procedural thing than it is an expression of self. So that's still probably, how they say, like, if you're like traumatized or something as children, you seek that in your adulthood because you're just most comfortable with it. That's where I'm most
Hmm.
comfortable.
Wow, there's so much in there. Thanks. I have a lot of thoughts on that. The first is that sort of immediacy in the moment, like the future hasn't happened, the past is not there anymore, and the present is this sort of morphing, changing, natural, causal, unfolding thing. It does sound super Taoist and kind of Buddhist as well, just to sort of like put an overlay of uh, some spiritual concepts in various traditions. You couldn't help but think of Taoist ways of relating to the world. And then that sense of what you can control and not control, like obviously very important from a sort of a functional point of view. And actually doing some sort of spiritual overlay on that, I couldn't help but think of the Serenity Prayer. Like
Mm.
if your life in some ways is an investigation of what you can and cannot control, and don't be too worried about what you can't control and see what you can control. Obviously, those are kind of Serenity Prayer-ish sort of things. Now, obviously, then the question of we should probably talk about empathy at some point because it's a frequent topic that I know is interesting in these conversations. But just from a sort of a like, it's very hard not to hear some spiritual teachings or frameworks that could possibly resonate with the things you just sort of described. And I'm also like super, it's interesting as I attempt to sort of model everybody's brain like here, and like it's very interesting to me to be sitting here and thinking about like me, for example. I think I have at least a sense of the public you better than I have of Don, but thinking about like how you're modeling this or what's the manipulation or like what's the gain or what's the transactional nature and trying to like sort of work with that. Like that's been an interesting sort of meta layer on this. Like what is the additional dynamic that is in play in the podcast is also kind of a meta question I have as I'm sort of going through this. Um, anyway, just my
Yeah.
thoughts.
Yeah. And I should probably, there's like maybe a little second part to this. Uh, Even though that was my natural experience, I still felt a sense of meaninglessness about life and lack of engagement. And I went to see a therapist and we worked on shoring up, I guess, strengthening my sense of self. And it does lead to more sense of engagement. I have a stronger sense of self than I used to have. I do feel more engaged. I feel more meaningful. I do try to, like, I do now experience a lot of things as being self expression. So that I have kind of moved away from that, I guess. I've moved up in the Kernberg thing up to maybe like neurotic a little bit, but it's still fluid. And I feel sometimes discomfort in being embodied a little bit more and in feeling like more of a sense of my history and more a sense of my future. And it gives me anxiety and it's difficult for me. I feel like I'm going through puberty with
Mm,
it, where I'm like, okay, this is difficult. And I'm trying to incorporate this in a way where I can, I guess my ultimate goal, and maybe this is just something I've just thought of right now, would be to have both, would be to have the engagement that's not coming, that's self expression, but not coming from a place of ego, I guess, and to have the equanimous sensation of understanding that at its core, everything is just either things I control or things I don't control, and not an expression of me at all.
wow, and very interesting. Thank you. There is also yet another sort of developmental or possible mode which is where the entire thing feels totally natural, which is slightly different from the feeling of I am a self that is not in control, or I am a vague thing that is not in control, like the entire thing just naturally unfolding all the way through. And yes, somewhere in that natural unfolding are sensations of control or not control, but those are really just both arising naturally from the big field of experience happening point of view. And so just know that there are maybe other options. Like the neurotypical question is also one I have a very interesting thing about. Some point at hopefully in this, I have this sort of theory of like awake tigers. Like, would an awake tiger just like appreciate the gazelle it's eating more, like, and
Mm.
sort of savor the moment? Like I'm sort of jumping a gun of like questions about like this question comes up all the time. Sort of for those not familiar with my some commentary on this. I think one of the great shadow sides of Buddhism is imagining that it will fully transform or heal or whatever, assuming you think these things need healing, which maybe people don't. I don't mean to give that overlay necessarily, of the like the personality disorders, particularly the sort of categorized cluster B sort of end of things. And I think a lot of people are kind of surprised when you can have very, very deep, profound practitioners who have undergone real transformations, learned real skills, can do deep meditative things, seem to have awakened in some technical sense, and yet they were sort of psychopaths before, and they're psychopaths after. And in some ways, actually awakening may actually be easier in some ways for them because the sense of self might already be thin, and they don't have to deal with the same kind of guilt and remorse that people who have more guilt and remorse have to deal with. They may have other challenges. That would actually be an interesting thing to ask about. Like, is it purely like optimal, like meaning are all this sort of psychopath variants like conducive to meditation, or do they have unique challenges that might be different? I don't know. Something that'd be fun to explore. Anyway, just a bunch of thoughts.
Yeah. I like how you say the psychopath variants because it is true. I'm just me and there are so many different types of people who are out there. And you talked about this idea of people, let's say cluster B personality disorders who become very skilled in spiritual practices.
Oh yeah.
And what was the name of it? Was the Institute? Is that what that particular podcast on
Yep.
the SoundCloud?
That's
I'll
the
link
one.
it. Yeah, it's really interesting. It's interesting to kind of hear that this insight that you have that those spiritual practices don't necessarily touch the cluster B characteristics of these people apparently like they retain those through all of these. I loved what you said about this idea of naturally unfolding. That's what my therapist used to say all the time, and I would like to get there, and sometimes I feel like I am there. I just don't know, and this is like an open question, and maybe you have insight, or Don, you have insight. Just don't know what role self plays in the natural unfolding. Is it like I feel like I'm
Mm,
constantly kind of tweaking things? I feel like, and I'm a relatively new bassist to playing orchestral style bass. I play jazz bass and electric bass. And it's just like the past 2 or 3 years that I've been playing like in a community orchestra. And sometimes I think it's a lot like the right hand of a bass, where the bow has to have pressure and friction in order to cause the string to resonate its most resonant, right? And you're constantly adjusting pressure and the friction of the bow on the string. And I think there's
mhm.
something to that, and it just has to be kind of practice and a constant kind of adjustment. But I'm not sure. I'm hoping that's true. I do want to get to the natural unfolding part.
Yeah, and the
Hmm.
fact that the wanting to get to the natural unfolding part, like the wantingness itself as a sort of a slippery, organic, felt thing, that's actually part of the gateway to that. Noticing that that wanting to get there is arising, you can't control it or stop it.
Hmm.
Like if you could stop it, you probably would. Anybody probably would because it feels uncomfortable. Like, but you can't. So the fact of just recognizing the natural unfolding of the wanting to get to a place where things are naturally unfolding
Yeah.
is one of the meta tricks to recognize it. And it can be a slippery, sort of curious, subtle thing.
Is it because it's interesting. My knowledge of like Buddhist teachings is pretty narrow, even though I try to learn, but I've never like kind of become a student of it. But isn't wanting something in Buddhism that we don't like? You saying that wanting is like the doorway to this, the pathway, I guess.
Yeah, so there's this very funny concept. I just want to back up, by the way, and say I'm also a bass player, so I appreciate your bass analogies. I don't have a like much of a public presence as a bassist, but you can hear a little bit of my stuff on SoundCloud. If you go looking for it, you can hear me playing bass on some stuff. But so anyway, just maybe we'll connect on that like later more. But the sense of okay, so you've got this concept of compassion, desire, and suffering, right? Compassion, the wish to not suffer, or the wish for others not to suffer. That's an interesting one in the context of psychopathy, like that, obviously that probably has some nuance that could be unpacked around that.
Yeah.
And then desire, and then suffering. So suffering and desire almost, these three kind of, you don't want to suffer, so you desire, and you suffer because you desire. And so
Mm,
there's like this very intricate, interactive, almost the same thing in some ways. It's interesting to sort of operationalize them as the same thing. And investigating suffering is one of the three characteristics. So for those not familiar with Vipassana practice or insight practice, from a Theravada or some other schools of Buddhism point of view, what you would do in insight practice if you're training to wake up is you would notice the three characteristics: impermanence, suffering, and no self of all experience. So you notice that things arise on their own, that's no self, and there's this tension or this wanting or this dissatisfaction or this anxiety or this, yeah, right? That sort of, and you can watch that as a naturally moving, changing, impermanent, shifting thing. And so the investigation of suffering, which is intimately bound up in desire and the wish not to suffer, right? Compassion, either for oneself or others. You can watch that as a living, like push-pull, like of attraction and desire, and that becomes a very important object. And seeing something about that, you can notice very directly for yourself that that desire just unfolds naturally,
mm,
and it changes, and it's ephemeral, and so it is not you in the same sense that it is not something you actually have control over, and there's not actually a separate thing observing it. So like, it's the funny thing, is the desire you, or are you observing the desire? Which is it? It can't be really both. So that should be a clue that something's going on there.
mm.
Um, and so those are some basic concepts of sort of Buddhist meditation practice that might be interesting to play around with.
Yeah. I do
Thoughts?
want to somebody has already suggested like emailed me one of my talking about kind of the Kronberg, the idea of being kind of this base thing that just experiences things. One of my favorite parts about being in that situation is I feel like I have more clarity of vision, let's say. Like I'm tracking reality better when I'm in those types of situations. And being in reality is my favorite feeling. That's like my most secure. It feels the most powerful even. It feels the most gentle to be in reality and to understand, yeah, that there here I am so small in this reality, and that feels comforting, like a baby being swaddled or whatever, so
Huh.
they stop smacking themselves with their face, with their hand or whatever. I That's my most comfortable position. And so I do really with like I appreciate the work my therapist did to strengthen my sense of self. And I don't think I could have stayed the way that I was. Like it was a very empty way of experiencing life. It felt too much and too little, kind of at the same time. And and so I want to track reality. I really do. So somebody was suggested that I try like a Vipassana sort of retreat. There's like one that's like close to Joshua Tree. That's like a 10-day one that I'm going to try to do this fall, I hope.
Well, just if you're going to go into something like a 10-day Goenka course with some informed consent of the
Mm.
risks, benefits, and alternatives, like what can
Okay.
happen, might I recommend my free online book, mctb.org. Just read chapter 30. Just read
Well,
chapter 30 of the highs,
write this
lows, and
down.
weirds that can occur, because they can be surprising and disruptive.
Okay.
And it has been noticed that sometimes the sort of volatility of what can happen in the stages of insight when crossed in the context of cluster B personality disorders can produce some very wild social effects.
Hmm.
So just go in with some, at least some heads up and an ability to kind of meta recognize if you get into one of these phases, to use whatever, it sounds like you've got a tremendous number of metacognitive skills of like what is going on with you, like that, a pretty high level of insight, right? In this sort of way. So I think you'd find these frameworks fascinating and maybe the unfolding of the stages fascinating as things to look at. Just my recommendation, chapter 30, mctb.org.
Okay, so I will check that out. And I should say too, Daniel, maybe you've heard this in some of the things that you've seen, or maybe not. In the therapy, like in getting the stronger sense of self, my psychopathic traits have diminished to where I probably am not diagnosable anymore. So you think that's,
Interesting.
yeah, it's really interesting. The other thing is, even though I still don't have like the automatic empathy, what do we call it? Not cognitive, the other one.
Affective.
Effective.
Affective empathy.
Right.
Even though I don't have that still, probably the brain was just never wired that way or something. And
That's my theory. Like, you may not have those centers, and that the neuroscience shows this. Actually, you just like you've shown a horrible image. Just that the fear centers don't light up, or the empathy centers, the emotional centers don't light up on
yeah,
fMRI.
whatever.
Sorry, continue. Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe structural.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I have had I did like a EEG, the
Hmm.
brainwaves scan
Yep.
for sleep. And the guy was like, I don't want to like alarm you. This is unusual, but it's common in certain populations like the autism population. He's like, but you have very low very low brain activity in the sections that we associate with like he said like multiple things, recognizing faces, empathy, like et cetera, et cetera. So but I do have like the cognitive empathy, and because now I have a sense of self, my own self, I think I have like a greater sense of compassion because now that I do know, hey, this is me, and it hurts my feelings when people say this, then I have a more informed cognitive empathy where I can be like, that might hurt somebody else's feelings too. But before I had the sense of self, I didn't understand anybody else either because I was like, you're separate from me and you're also an actor, but the way I experience my own self is so small. And so I just assume you're all experiencing it small too, and where you can just kind of take this stuff and it doesn't matter to you. And now that
Yeah.
I have the sense of self or whatever, now I'm like, yeah, you take these things that my therapist calls identity hits, and they suck, and they are like a gut punch. And so I try not to do that with others. That's why I've gotten so careful about consent, is because I think, wow, everybody has their own personhood and autonomy, and that's really important. And if you hurt that, that's almost the worst thing that you can hurt. And that's why rape is almost as bad as murder, worse maybe than murder. And then so realizing this, so I want to take like the insights I have from like having a greater sense of self and being able to be like, okay, that's how everybody else experiences the world too, is from this sense of self lens, let's say. Like that helps me to understand a lot more what people are doing. And yeah, just because you have suggested a couple times, the dangers of cluster B, and cluster B people should, they have their issues or whatever. But I think it is interesting to think like this, their issues kind of melt away when you just continue the cycle all the way up the Kernberg cycle and just get a sense of self. Like their issues do seem to go away. So their issues do seem to be stemming from some place of having an insecure attachment to their self, is probably the best way that I can think of to put it.
Well,
Yes. Oh,
sorry, I just
oh,
have one.
yeah, sorry.
Sorry, Don, you have not talked in a while. I just want to insert this one thing before I forget it because my brain is very slippery. Um, so yeah, going on Vipassana retreats is intrinsically designed to deconstruct the sense of self.
Hmm.
And it has routinely been said in Western psychological circles that it does seem to help to have a stronger sense of self before you do that particular type of sensate deconstruction. So I think the work you've done to sort of have more selfiness or self-awareness or something like probably will serve you well. And those same metacognitive skills will almost serve you very well. So yeah, keep those sharp and engaged.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
Yeah, like I actually have two questions that I meant to ask later on that sort of tie in with that. Like one of them is exactly this, like what is the self good for? And Um, you, Daniel, seem to have sort of done away with it, and it seems to work just fine for you. So my theory is that maybe you need that in order to learn how to behave in society and how to interact with other people. But once you've learned that, and you're unlikely to forget it, maybe you don't need it anymore. Does that make sense?
That's that transcend include thing from Wilber. So I have my issues with Wilber's hierarchical model, some of them, but some of them are pretty useful. I don't know if people familiar with the work of Ken Wilber, sort of integral psychology stuff. But the idea is that, like, yeah, you adopt a sense of self and then you see through the sense of self, but yet all the lessons or functionality that hopefully you had with that. But it can be a somewhat bumpy process. So, like, that sounds all very rosy and nice and easy, but the actual experience of it can be very disorienting and confusing. So, like, you can go through kind of like the stages of grief at the sense of, oh, I used to think I have control and now I don't seem to, or I used to think I was really sane and now I'm seeing that maybe I'm kind of crazy sometimes, like, or whatever it is, like, or I used to think this and now I think that, as we go through these layers of seeing into the strata of our experience, and you get all these this sort of whole person tour of what's there and all the good, bad, and the weird. It can be both revealing and very disappointing, or frustrating, or embarrassing, or just disorienting, right? As you shift into these new configurations of how reality is processed and experienced, yeah, it can be people, even people that don't appear to have any cluster B personality diagnoses, can become very reactive, very contracted, very angry, very volatile, very like it can sort of induce that kind of mode in some people, particularly if they cross the A and P and hit the dark night. Like people who never seem to have a lot of sort of cluster B-ish kind of behavioral or cognitive or whatever traits, coping traits, can suddenly get a bunch of them, which is sort of a surprise for a lot of people. And those who are kind of already familiar with them, actually, I wonder if they might do better, because they're all like, oh, I know what it's like to split. I've done that. Or I know what it's like to totally discount someone else's feelings. Or I know what it's like to take things super personally or something. Like, I wonder if a sort of a life of having to learn to adapt in society with some of those underlying tendencies might in some ways actually be protective if you ran into this territory, because if you hadn't really had to figure out how to navigate in that space, it might be more challenging. These are just my thoughts as they're coming to me. Um,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's also something that I wondered about. Maybe I'll touch on it in a later question again. I was also wondering whether maybe it's possible if like Jamie goes on this retreat to instead like do the process backwards. There's some way to like figure out where in the process she currently is, and then learn to like undo, like go back, like count back the nanas, count back the jhanas, do some practices to get to the zeroth jhana.
The zeroth jhana is an interesting concept that you've mentioned a number of times, and it's not a term I'm that familiar with, and I apologize for not having asked for sort of a clarifying definition earlier. What does the term mean to you?
Yeah, like I just mean by that, yeah, I'd probably have to do a lot of concentration and insight practice in order to even get to the first jhana. And so the state that I'm currently in, that's what I conceive of as like the zeroth jhana. So before people who have not yet reached the first jhana. Does that
Mm.
make sense?
Well, it's interesting. So it is very rare for people to read my book and to get all the way through it and to care about these things if they have not at some point crossed the stage I would call the arising and passing away, which is sort of like a first stage of, like, it's like the beginning of the adolescent period of meditative development. And so, and just kind of by its nature, in the tradition I come at least, would generally be labeled as the second Vipassana jhana, so some kind of jhanic thing. So, and then ME, if you're thinking about doing a Vipassana retreat, that is the kind of thing that people who have crossed into some sort of insight territory are much more likely to think about, and it generally would make very little sense to someone who hadn't. That doesn't mean that either of you have, but it'd be interesting, like when I say stuff about energy or bliss or like suddenly perceiving reality very rapidly, or suddenly having very vivid dreams that might have vibratory or vortexy or explosive or transcendent or kind of magical strong components or something. Like, does any of that resonate with either of you two? I don't know if you checked out any of my book stuff, but from your past or history, does any of that make any sense?
I haven't checked out your book stuff yet. But I am chapter 20 and everything else.
Sorry,
I'm
chapter 30. Yeah.
chapter 30.
Yeah, it's all right.
Did I write it in correctly?
I don't know.
Yes, chapter 30. Okay.
Cool.
Yeah. I don't know if I just realized, and I was just talking to Don while we were waiting for you to log on, that I just realized that I don't have, and there's a word for this. I forget the word. It's kind of sounds like aphasia, but it's not, where you cannot picture things vividly in your mind's eye, right? And I just learned that a
Aphantasia.
day or two. Yeah, you know it. Just learned this a day or two ago, and I was like, how did I not realize this before? Like, and so I sometimes wonder, like, how many conditions are we in that we're not kind of aware of? Number one. Number two, I realized this the other day, kind of trying to like sleep longer in the morning, is that in my dreams, I do see things in my mind's eye, right? And it's so vivid that I feel like I'm in that world. And then when I wake up, it's like jarring because those visions kind of like disappear. I can't even, if I even try to think about that world again, it looks kind of like my Zoom window right now. It has like a green outline. It's like
Hmm.
that's really all I see in my mind's eye is this weird kind of green outline of the thing. Almost like it's like a laser light show and it's just the vaguest little impression of something. So I from this, I have thought too, and this is like a little bit of a tangent, but maybe relevant, that that's one of the difficulties I have in sleeping is trying to get over this hump from having no internal vision to having a completely immersive internal vision. And that's, I think it's jarring when I wake up and it changes, so it's like a bump. It really feels like a bump to me to get up and over, and you have to have like enough kind of speed to get up and over into the sleep and to like get up and over into the wakefulness peacefully. Yeah. So I don't know.
Well, there's actually neuroscience about this. So if you look at the default mode network and the PCC, so the posterior cingulate cortex, so there's neuroscientific studies of the brains of psychopath that they may have, or people who have that sort of neighborhood of traits or experiences, that a lot of them have some altered from whatever normal is, right? Sense of default mode network functioning. So default mode network and the PCC, in this case, the PCC activating, I got to actually play in an fMRI at Yale and EEG at Yale and UMass, looking at the PCC and how it functions. So I got some real-time feedback. So I actually have a real sense of this for myself, sort of
Mm,
a rare opportunity that I got about 11 years ago. And when the PCC is activated and it's got a lot of blood flow to it, sort of consensus reality sort of disappears, and it makes it much easier to have your inner world be much brighter, more vivid, more compelling,
mm,
more absorbing. Um, but it turns out psychopaths actually have, a lot of them have reduced PCC or default mode network functioning or connectivity, such that it is harder to just sort of disappear into your inner world and tune the world out, which may also make it harder to like. I'm no neuroscientific expert in this. I've just been doing some reading on it, but may make it harder to actually visualize something very vividly because the ordinary world, by comparison of sort of volume, you don't have may not have quite as much ability to tune it down or make it go away.
mm.
Like when checking your internal calendar or imagining like a new house you were going to build or something, like to just kind of like tune reality out and have those things become really bright.
Yeah.
So you may have more tuning out or less natural tuning out capacity, but these are trainable skills actually.
Hmm.
So, these pathways are plastic and workable.
Yeah. It's interesting because I do kind of feel, and sometimes people have said it's kind of autistic. I do feel sometimes overwhelmed by just like constantly perceiving things from the outside world, I guess. Like the kind of it's so I sleep with earplugs and a sleep mask, like I'm overstimulated is the best way to put it. Because and I feel like I see all these things about people. I'm like, okay, you're like closeted gay or whatever. I see all these read all these things about people that I don't want to kind of hear. I feel like I'm almost like in their worlds more than I am in mine, is what it feels like sometimes. And that can be overstimulating. So yeah, I sleep 10 hours a night, and sometimes I'll just rest, and the way I rest is sleep mask, earplugs.
Nice. Yeah, that intersection of sort of neuroatypicality and the sort of spectrum of autism stuff that we think about these days, like how that might interface with any of this. Like, yeah, your sort of meta capacities, the way you map this, the kind of like, of course, we just talk about this kind of straightforwardly. Like there, I was recognizing some sort of things that felt a touch sort of Asby-ish too.
Mm,
I obviously am definitely no normie, right? I'm somewhere on the atypical, neuroatypical spectrum-y something. I don't test out autistic, but nobody would think I was normally built, right? Whatever that means.
yeah.
So yeah, it's interesting to see those resonances there. And obviously, Dawn, if you're so into like how all of these theories apply, like it has like anyway, just
I know,
no,
Don.
noticing a commonality there.
Yeah, let me just share. Like the last time I spoke with you, Don, and Daniel, you weren't here or whatever, but I felt like I had just taken like a standardized test for 3 hours. I was like, wow, my cognitive function is really low. I've just been like running at high speed, as high as I can go to keep up.
I'm sorry.
No, it's fine.
No, it's
Anyway,
it's fun.
and Don, I realize you have all kinds of questions I'm sure you want to ask and get through, and we've now burned through almost an hour. So I was just being metacognitive of that. Should we get to some of the list, or are we
Yeah.
having fun doing this?
Yeah, but like there's also one question that ties in really well with what you mentioned earlier, that some people with, for example, psychopathy who do like insight practices, for example, seem to have a bit of a head start. And that is also something that I was wondering about. Like, of course, someone with psychopathy, or like in particular, if the person also has like co-occurring like pathological narcissism or something, might be concerned that, like especially in the second case, I suppose, might be concerned that they won't be quickly enough, good enough at the thing, in order for them to be able to like tolerate the difficulty of that the progress poses. And so I was wondering whether there's perhaps a case to be made that they already have a bit of a head start, so that they can make progress more quickly, at least at first, whether this is advisable at all. And then also, well, the question, like for me, there seem to be sort of three different types of psychopathy, and it probably doesn't make that much sense to have one term for all three of them because they seem vastly different. Um, and one of them is sort of a friend of mine. It's like an extreme example of this. They were like born without all of these like facilities for like empathy and for experiencing all sorts of emotions themselves, and then just sort of learned all of that, had like a negative example in the father, positive example in the mother, and we're like, okay, I want to be like the mother, and so just sort of built from like the earliest age onward all the habits that were necessary, like for example also learned to respect other people's autonomy very highly, and yeah, all sorts of other habits and ways of thinking, and so never had like any kind of playground phase or anything of the sort. Like Jamie has this term playground phase for like a phase when people with psychopathy usually learn to like gradually learn to function in society in a way that like works for everyone, and was just sort of really normal from the start. Except, of course, when you talk about like their internal experience, then it's very unusual. And yeah, so this is like one type of psychopathy. Then there is this type of psychopathy that seems much more much closer really to pathological narcissism in my conception anyway, where someone creates just an unusually stable false self of sorts, and it also has like an unusually easy time with acceptance and with like being sort of aware and not self-deluded about what they are doing. So that's really fascinating to see. But those people usually say that they've built this relatively consciously around the time of puberty at some point. So definitely not something that's been there all their lives, but something that they like built around the age of like 11 to 13 or so.
Hmm.
And one friend of mine in particular sort of switched into that. I know at around age 16 or so, and then switched out of it again around age like 21 or whatever it was. So that is something that someone would just not be able to do, I suppose, if they're just genetically predisposed to that particular makeup. And then wondering like these seem like okay, there are different dimensions here. These different types of psychopathy seem very different to me. There's also a third one. I don't know anyone who has it, so I can't say a lot about it. I don't think I know anyone. Um, and there seems to be also the similarity of like the second type of psychopathy with pathological narcissism, where just pathological narcissism is sort of a version where it's a bit less stable, and psychopathy is a version where it's a bit more stable. But otherwise, these seem very similar to me.
Hmm.
And so I was wondering, does this even make sense? Like, I would expect then people with pathological narcissism and people with this second type of psychopathy to be somewhere in a similar realm in along the like the jhanas, or like this path to the awakening. And but maybe you mentioned equanimity, which is like really far to the end of this process. And apparently that seems like really similar to Jamie's experience to you. And I previously mentioned like the arising and passing away, and the entry to the Dark Knight as something where I see pathological narcissism, but maybe I'm completely wrong about that. So that would
People can get
indicate that there's
extremely
actually a big
narcissistic.
difference between these.
Sorry, yeah, people can get extremely narcissistic both in the A and P in the Dark Knight. Like they're
Yeah.
fascinated by how amazing and clear and wondrous and blissful and concentrated they are, and then they're fascinated by how much their life sucks and all of their judgments about themselves and the world and their reactivity.
Yeah.
So like there are definitely two phases in the insight cycle where narcissism is routinely noted, even in people who didn't may not have formally diagnosed as narcissistic, can suddenly become quite narcissistic, but in sort of opposite ways. One, I am amazing, and
Hmm.
I am judging the world, and it sucks, and I suck, and everything sucks. Right. So kind of wrapped up in that. But sort of backing up, while you were saying all of that and talking about the different types of narcissists, like and having your that sort of conceptual way of categorizing all of these people, I kept thinking back to my time in emergency departments. So I was an emergency medicine physician as an attending for 12 years and 3 years of residency, and you get to deal with a staggering amount of narcissism and psychopathy on all sides of it. So, like a non-trivial portion of the emergency departments or hospitals I worked in had at least one or two obvious narcissistic psychopaths in administration, some of whom were extraordinarily capable and effective. Like, I don't want anybody like pattern matching on anything I'm about to say here. Like, but one of the actually the very best setting I ever worked in was crafted by a very high functioning narcissistic psychopath. And because they were a narcissist, they had to have the best of everything. And because they were a psychopath, they didn't care what they had to do to get it. And so, but the result was something absolutely amazing. But you just kind of had to know, like, that they were what they were. And it's kind of like having a pet tiger. You know, you wouldn't want to like leave your 2 year old baby around the pet tiger at lunchtime because, the baby might just be lunch. And being around one of these people is kind of like that. Like you can be around them and there can be tremendous benefit from them. I gained and learned a lot from them, but you would never want to forget what they are and the way they relate to the world. Um, and one time I actually asked them, hey, what is it like to have no guilt or empathy? And they just smiled at me like, oh, you noticed my hair or something like that kind of a smile, like, oh wow, yeah, because they were proud of it, like they thought this was a seriously upgraded mod, of human whatever. And they were like, what idiot would feel empathy? Like, someone is already feeling pain, how is you feeling more pain when they're already feeling pain? How is that a good idea? Just adding pain to pain. And if you feel guilt, that's just going to slow you down from doing what you need to do. And because I have absolutely no guilt or empathy, I'm a wolf among sheep. And they just smiled, like,
Hmm.
uh, you know, and um, so, and then contrasting that with other people who came into the emergency department on the narcissism, psychopathy gone very wrong side, like from the prison gunshot, like whatever interactions with the police went horribly, violently wrong or whatever it was. Like, and so it was really interesting to see that there is this incredible range of what this sort of neighborhood of neuroatypicality or neurovariance means in terms of the way it can manifest in the world. And thinking about, then I think actually the one of these people is now going on intensive meditation retreats, and I think they're doing very well. And I think their particular mods make them very capable of kind of whatever they try to do. But in I think meditation is another one of those things that they're very capable of. Um, Whereas like some of the it's hard to imagine some of the people who their life had kind of decompensated as a result of their particular set of traits, and it had not gone that well in a societal, legal, etc. context. Like some of them, like I would anticipate more trouble, like trying to sit quietly, look within, like
Mhm.
see what was there. Like I would guess that they probably would not be as adapted to a meditative context. Sorry, it was kind of a long answer, probably interesting for the viewership, hopefully.
Mhm.
Thoughts? I see you smiling a lot
Yeah,
at me,
just
by the way. Like I see a lot of
I love
laughter
the
there.
smile. Yeah, these are, well, it is so true. I mean, this like spectrum of psychopathy is just so broad. And
Hmm.
I think, I often think, I even think about this, this is maybe like a little bit of a tangent. But you talk about the science fiction book, The Institute, right? Is what it's called.
It's actually The Demon Princes.
Oh, The
The
Demon
Demon
Princes.
Princes is a five-book series by Jack Vance, my favorite author, who's also the author of The Eyes of the Overworld and Kugel's Saga, which is explicitly about a psychopath. And and like unironically Vance's favorite character of all time, like the most beloved, and is truly like an unabashed, guilt-free psychopath that has no remorse for anything they do, and they leave a spectacular trail of destruction in their wake. Though they're in all aspects of it, there is kind of a weird sense of poetic justice in the
Mm.
destruction they leave. So anyway, so yeah, this is about the Institute. Just a quick introduction. The Institute, and Jack Vance appears in the Demon series novels, which you think would be fantasy, but is actually sci-fi. And it's this idea that this sort of pan-galactic organization that is extra governmental and kind of like structured with hierarchies, kind of like the Masons as a secret society. They do whatever is necessary to keep the level of technology on all worlds below the level at which a lone psychopath could end life on the planet. And they justify anything and everything that they do, however psychopathic: wars, destruction, sabotaging experiments, political disruption, chaos, whatever. What do they do is, if it is less bad than all of life being ended on a world, which would eventually happen through technology, then they can justify it as being better than what would have happened. So very utilitarian, kind of almost like psychopathic way of relating to psychopaths at their
Hmm.
extreme end of world destroying, supervillain level. So anyway, yeah, so I find these stories and ideas fascinating. What were your thoughts?
So I thought, and this is a mega spoiler, right? So just saying it, I think it is. I haven't read the books, but you said it in the podcast about this, that the main purpose of the Institute is not to keep the world from being destroyed, right? It is to
keep going. Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah, it's to give people like a sense of purpose, right? A sense of purpose and meaning. And I feel like that's the thing that actually is like touches upon probably the psychopath's motivation more than anything else of whatever. Because like you have all these people, psychopaths out there, no sense of self, no sense of meaning, and they're just trying to fill that whole emptiness that they experience. It's not like an emptiness, like a sad, like emo, like. But sometimes people are like, "That's the most emo thing you ever say," the emptiness, and I'm like, okay, I just mean there's like a lack. There's just no presence. It's not like a darkness, except to the extent that there's just nothing there, and that's just what it means to be dark, I guess. And so I thought that was the more interesting point than I mean, Don disagrees maybe because Don is an effective altruist and cares about worlds being destroyed. Me, no. I just care about the sense of having like a sense of purpose and meaning in my life, like a reason to kind of get up in the morning. And I think that if we solve that for psychopaths, then we'll like the people who are the ER doctor heads or whatever in the administrative staff, they have found it. You know, they found something at least that scratches the itch close enough that they're getting something from it. And the
Yeah.
people doing the lowest level whatever, in, you know, the sub legal, let's say,
Hmm.
stuff, they're doing it that way too. And that's the thing that I think that they kind of have in common. They have all these, you know, like lack of empathy, guilt, you know, that allows them to kind of do things on the extremes of anywhere, but they're trying to figure out like a, and I sometimes think this with especially like pre kind of like a stronger sense of self, like there's a desire there, I think, to feel a sense of self.
Mm.
I think there's that
Yeah,
natural
this.
desire to kind of like to see yourself reflected somehow, you know, to kind of understand yourself as being a separate thing. So I think there's often a motivation with psychopaths to see your effect in the world. Like if you can't feel it internally, then you want to see people cry or laugh or, you know, cry for joy or whatever else it is. And so you're constantly like looking for like almost like a extreme entrepreneur, arbitrage style entrepreneur. You're just always looking for ways in which you can flip a switch and there's going to be the biggest change. That's what you're constantly looking for. Flip a switch, biggest change. Biggest change to anything, positive, negative. You just want to feel like you are an actor in the world because you don't have that sense. You feel like you're just in the stream and you don't even have fins sometimes. And so when you do use the fins, then you're like, okay, I do feel it. It reminds me, my dad just had a stroke, and it was not that bad. He, so his right side's numb. He says, and he says he has to tell his like hand, his right hand to move. And that's a little bit what it feels like. It feels like you're just numb, but you can see your right hand move. You can see your right hand flipping the switch and you can see the change that's enacted in the world. So you feel the numbness, you don't feel the connection to the fact that you are the person doing the thing, but you at least do see the thing happen, and that assuages some of this discomfort you feel and not having sense of self, I think.
So just throwing out a concept in Buddhism that gets thrown around in Western circles a lot in reaction to all that really interesting stuff was this notion of like too much emptiness, like or too much fullness.
Mm,
Like, so this is the kind of poles that we get thrown back and forth between. And then when we get too much emptiness, we have this desire for existence. And when we have too much fullness, we have the desire to tune out,
mm,
right? So like
yeah.
when you talk about like being sensatedly overstimulated, you want less.
Mm-hmm.
And when you talk about not enough sense of self in the center or whatever it is, you want more. And so actually like watching that push pull of these two poles, right? These are the kind of the two fundamental poles of the whole of the spiritual meditative dance. The sense of wanting more, wanting less, extinctionism, eternalism, like wanting to super tune in and wanting to super tune out, like the formless realms, the formless jhanas, boundless space, boundless consciousness, nothingness, are a refuge because there's just nothing. And also some people find them really terrifying because they can't find a body, they can't feel themselves breathing, and they want like a blissful, peaceful, dramatic, wah kind of thing. And so you find like, like people like the 5-MeO versus DMT crowd, or the like, sort of the people who would more gravitate towards ketamine versus cocaine or MDMA or something like that. Like, you can find this in societies and people's polarities of like people who just want to walk in a quiet forest versus people who want to be like, dancing in a 130 decibel rave, like, and that fundamental push-pull of like more or less is one of the greatest driving things of everybody, and including it seems like this kind of dynamic as well.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, that is also something where I have another question about that.
oh,
I
cool.
think actually, a little anecdote. A friend of mine, the friend with the like 5 year psychopathy phase, um, really disliked this feeling of like, yeah, this particular type of emptiness. Like the term emptiness is like used in so many different ways in my experience, but yeah, like this particular type, she felt like no particular reason to be alive, and that was like so harrowing or like so pointless that eventually she chose even borderline, like all the suffering that comes with borderline over that. So like I think the psychopathy was sort of a defense against the borderline. So it worked, but came at that cost. And
Mm.
eventually, when she got out, she didn't want to go back, rather wanted to accept the suffering that comes with borderline and to do like dialectical behavioral therapy to deal with that, than to go back to that like brand of emptiness. And that's really was really impressive to me because I imagine borderline being so painful. And yeah, so that seemed striking to me. And I actually forgot what the question was that I wanted to tie this in with. I think it came on later. Yeah, I know.
Can I interrupt then? I have like something that's been eating my brain. Don, you said something about narcissistic psychopaths, and you said that they had the psychopath allows them to do something, but the narcissism keeps them from what? Keeps them from seeing reality or keeps them from. This is going to be really hard. I should just go back and watch the video.
Uh-huh. I don't know exactly. Like
It
something
will.
that I said earlier in this.
Yeah, when you said there are three types of psychopaths, and you're talking about
Yeah.
like the narcissistic ones. So one thing I have noticed with psychopaths with narcissism, and maybe it was Daniel actually who said this, and my girlfriend often says this about me, is that I am like more of like a cerebral or something psychopath, like less self even than she has. She's also a psychopath, and she says she calls herself an Amy Dunn psychopath. Do you know Gone Girl,
Mm.
the book or movie?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So Amy Dunn is the one who fakes her own death, spoiler alert, to to like frame her husband. And she really is gonna die. That's her like plan or whatever. And that's just like not something I would do because I don't care. I'm not jealous. My ego's not hurt by things like that. Like I can take identity hits, but I don't even see hierarchy of human value or something, or I don't feel devalued by people. I can feel like they're depersonalizing me, but not
Mhm.
devalued, I guess, if that makes sense. Um, like if they just ignore my humanity totally, but if they're like, oh, you're not as smart as you think, then I'm like, okay.
Mhm.
But with
Interesting.
the narcissism, and I see it sometimes when other psychopaths, if they have like a little bit of narcissism,
Hmm.
it can often be kind of volatile. It's like water and oil, dropping a thing of water in like a pan full of like very hot oil, like it's going to pop or something. There's going to be some weird reactivity there from that kind of combination. And man, I totally forget. Has this sparked anybody's thoughts about like,
I'm just wondering if you feel you kind of won the cluster B lottery. Like if you're gonna be cluster B, like if that's the one to have. Like
yeah.
have you ever thought you really kind of like yeah, the sense of gratitude or appreciation for it? Because like there's been, Don, you were talking about like how painful borderline can be, right? There could be a lot of stuff there. And like you're talking about how like narcissism can be all reactive or whatever, but like is there the sense that like, you know, something appreciative in some ways that you didn't get those?
Yes, I think so because it has been, for the most part, it's not really led to bad, I guess, situations for me, except for like the lack, just the lack of whatever, existence, the sense of existence, I guess. But one kind of thinking about this, I think of it though as a spectrum. I do. And so this is why I really like this Kronberg guy who agrees with me, or I agree with him. The analogy I've used sometimes is it's like you're in a motorboat, like on the river or lake or something. And if you're in the driver's seat, then you have a normal sense of self, right? And if you're a psychopath, then you're like out on the rope, like a 40-foot rope or whatever, and you're at the end. And whatever's happening up in the boat affects you, but it doesn't really. And you don't feel like you're in the driver's seat. And then as you kind of like climb up the rope, then you get these other cluster Bs. You get like narcissism. And the borderline people are like hanging on at the back of the boat. And so everything the boat's doing, they feel it so much. They feel it kind of directly, but they don't feel like they're in control. And I think that part
Mm.
of the process of getting a sense of self, you kind of do go through all the stages. You're in borderline for a little bit as you go up into the driver's seat of the boat.
Oh,
Uh,
interesting. Huh.
yeah, but I don't feel like I was there for very long, probably like 10 months maybe. And that's what feels really unstable. That's probably the most puberty-esque part of it is where you're like, ah. Like everything seems so loud and crazy and I don't know how to handle my feelings and I have feelings and I used to not really experience my feelings the same kind of like the same personal way. You'd have feelings, but you'd experience them like in this, they're not happening to you almost. They're happening to you in the next room or something. There's like a distance, whatever, from the feelings. And then when you finally experience them, then it's like really crazy. And that's how I feel like borderline people are just stuck there. And I'm like, you're just stuck hanging on the back of the boat. So I have a lot of sympathy for the other cluster B personality disordered people.
Wow, this has actually helped me sort of with an empathic modeling. I have a friend who is a self and professionally diagnosed narcissist. And like, okay, they're a narcissist, fine, can work with that, right? They've got, the narcissistic thing and, known there for a long time. And, but recently, if as they went through some sort of complicated growth process, all of a sudden there were all these cluster, like sort of like borderline kind of traits that started coming out like that I'd never really seen before. And if they had them, either they were well compensated or hidden, or they just didn't have them. And so this is really interesting because I'm wondering if they're actually like getting in touch with emotions they didn't have, just as you're describing, and like going through kind of an adolescence with those. It's
Yeah.
giving like as an attempt to like an ASB modeler
Mhm.
and an empathic person, like, oh wow, okay, maybe this is a growth phase that leads to something useful rather than what seemed like a substantial regression and like, oh no, like this is not okay. Like narcissism was tolerable, but narcissism plus borderline is proving challenging, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
So,
so difficult
um,
to deal with it when you're on the
huh.
outside too of borderline. You're like, wow. But I think this too with babies. It's funny that you call me an Aspie modeler because it has helped me to deal with even like crying babies. Like I'm the aunt of 19 nieces and nephews, so I've had my share of crying babies. There's a baby that lives in the apartment complex across the way, and I can just hear like the infant cries were like they're so small, and now you can tell the baby's 4 months. I've never met this baby. I just can hear the cries from my open window, and I think, oh, your cries are getting strong. And my girlfriend, the more narcissistic psychopath, she like hates the sound of, and she's a only child, hates the sound of crying. But I always tell her like the best thing to do is just imagine you're the baby and you're so pissed. And like think about just how pissed you would be as this baby, and like nobody's doing the thing that you need them to. And then it makes total sense that the baby's crying. Like you can't be upset with a baby for crying when it makes all the sense in the world that they're so pissed and you guys have all fucked up.
Yeah. It's funny, actually, this reminds me of a Buddhist concept of Mara. So in Buddhism, this is the realm of samsara, the realm of ignorant suffering, run by the sort of demon, but in some ways high god Mara, who's like a tempter and kind of psychopathic. And so like this is an intrinsically sort of psychopathic realm, or reality is actually kind of a fundamental Buddhist concept. Like it's designed sort of like it's intrinsically going to mess with you. And is I'm paraphrasing something that's much more complicated and nuanced for the sake of sort of pop consumption. But like once you sort of recognize that in that same kind of way, like of course it's crying, like it's being born in the realm of samsara run by the demon Mara, it's going to be a mess. What did
Yeah.
you expect? Yeah.
Yeah.
I found it like super useful that you just mentioned this friend of yours. Like, would you say that this friend is like the sort of pure pathological narcissism type of person who has a lot of empathy, but then has like these shame triggers, and when the shame triggers are hit, then the empathy sort of cuts out because they're not mentalizing correctly, like not really thinking about the other person in a like detailed and fluent way, and like that sort of thing going on? Because then I'm like really curious where you would place all of these different people in terms of like ñana, so what they're pronounced, or jhanas for that matter. Like
Well,
your friend, maybe the person you know from the emergency department, and Jamie.
so I have to be extremely careful here, right? Because I don't want to out anybody. And if I say enough, like there are people who might be able to figure stuff out, and I really don't want to do that.
Oh,
But
yeah.
what I can say is sort of generically, um, one of the interesting things about my work that is kind of different from most of Buddhism, for those not familiar with me or what I do, most of Buddhism says if you get awakened and then you will be a good person. And if you get awakened, you can't break precepts like not killing, not stealing, not lying, not, sexual misconduct, et cetera. And if you're, and then if you're awakened, you might have deep meditative abilities, right? Generally, and these sorts of like, if you get the one thing, you will get the other thing as a package. What my experience has been is that I have some friends and acquaintances and other people who are in my sort of extended social circles and people I know of who I think have very, very high levels of meditative attainment. They've done tons of retreat time. They're very accomplished meditators. They can describe the phenomenology. I have no doubt they're getting into or very little doubt they're getting into the territory they say they are. And yet, their ethical behavior in the world, their way of compensating their level of psychological development from like a Keegan point of view or whatever other map you want to use, their personality quirks and maybe sometimes cluster B-ish sort of V traits and neuroatypicality may still be in full force and occasionally can sometimes even become more cartoon-like or absurd or like as they get more awakened and more transcendent of any ordinary sense of self, as that dissolves more and more, some have become more sort of like disinhibitedly from a sort of normie society point of view, more sort of psychopathic or dysregulated or not able to fit in sometimes in an ordinary way because their ordinary morality now seems even more absurd to them from whatever kind of Vajrayana process or this is sort of like tantric kind of process that they're going through. So of the various Buddhist schools, you have like the Vajrayana that relates to all of the energies as workable things, whereas the Theravada is like, you should not be hateful or cruel or,
Mm.
whatever. Whereas Vajrayana is like hate and wrath and rage and whatever, fear, all energies you can work with. Obviously, the Vajrayana tends to have a lot more scandals, like than the Theravada, which is much more boring, usually, but also more sort of moral and restrained and whatever. So, like, I've seen this unfold. I know thousands of meditators at this point, and so I know a whole lot of people, and I can say, at least it seems very clear to me that whatever jnana or insight stage or jhanic capacity or even path or however you want to think of awakening, these are stages of awakening in traditional classic Buddhist sense. From my moderately to extremely non-orthodox point of view, you could still, your life and way of relating to it can still have uneven development from, sort of a psychological, self-actualized, idealized point of view.
Mm.
So
Yeah, I
that's a
imagine.
generic answer to the pointed question that hopefully
Yeah,
doesn't
I
reveal
imagine
too
like
terribly much about anybody.
if I imagine that if someone has some personality disorder, maybe they start out sort of in the second or third jhana and then like get to equanimity more quickly or something. But then when they like stop the meditation, get up from the cushion, then they just sort of jump back to the second or third jhana or whatever, and not actually to the sort of selfhood that would have taught them how to behave in society. And maybe
Well,
that's the
that's the
problem.
assumptions that jhanas so jhanas, for those, we also haven't defined these. So for the audience, what is it? A jhana, lots of different ways to think about this, but a jhana from one point of view is like a very specific temporary meditative attainment where you've included very positive qualities and excluded negative ones. So you might have a very concentrated, clear, blissful, peaceful mind, and you have excluded the hindrances of doubt and restlessness and distraction and whatever, right? So that might be a way of conceiving of jhana. Or you can conceive of jhana as like a vipassana jhana is somewhere on the insight map of arising and passing away, dark nighty, equanimity-ish, right? A and P is like second vipassana jhana, dark night is sort of third vipassana jhana, equanimity, sort of fourth jhana. These are all different ways and terms people might use these. I'm not trying to pick one or the other. The orthodox people are all cringing at me now. Sorry. And then that question of what you can do on the cushion and how it impacts your daily life. So this is like, there are terms like spiritual bypassing or practice not integrated, these kinds of labels that get thrown around that have some kind of point, which is where you might be able to get into, you're sitting on the cushion and you might have a very blissful experience or peaceful experience or well-concentrated experience or expansive, flowy experience or formless experience. And then you get up off the cushion and you're still an asshole or something, right? Or you do something, really unfortunate from a sort of normie morality, societal, social, psychology point of view. And this is called either uneven integration or spiritual bypassing or something. And it's incredibly common. Like, how many people do I know who really check all the boxes of like what you would think of as a highly developed spiritual person on all aspects? In all situations, very, very, very few. But do I know a whole lot of people who are very good meditators and on the cushion can do really cool things? Yeah, I know vastly more of those. So I actually think that the deep meditative stuff, weirdly enough, is easier to do. This is a surprise to most people than to necessarily be a nice, highly self-actualized good person in some sort of normie, whatever sense, if that makes
Is
sense.
Yeah. Is there something that people can do that, like, if they are sort of not well-rounded, they have sort of the concentration and everything dialed in, but like, and they understand like no self and impermanence and dissatisfactoriness, but they don't understand like the opposites of that.
Yeah, like how to
That
be
they
a
can like
sort of
somehow
normal peace
use that
person,
exactly, that they can somehow use their concentration, like how good they are at the authors, to like get to the point where they can attain those.
Well, I think that's one of the weird ways that Buddhism has been brought to the West. So I think the ways Buddhism has been brought to the West are either it is pure psychology. So you see a lot of people, they go on a retreat and it's all psychology. They're thinking about their issues, their job, their relationships, their childhood, their slights, their desires, their neuroses. Like that is all they're doing on the cushion. You have those people. And they have very little deep meditative ability or insights or concentrations. They don't get into jhanas and wild energetic territory or any of that kind of stuff. And that development, while important, feels uneven to me. And then I see a whole bunch of people, like I was certainly initially, at least, and how integrated I am now. Widely varying opinions. I, I was able to develop very strong concentration abilities. My natural inclinations to just and follow instructions and like push things away and be able to tune into various qualities of mind. I had some gifts for that, but like it took me a much longer time to figure out how in the world to integrate those. And I see a lot of friends who have some talent for this, and yet that this side may not necessarily be all that functionally integrated. And what I haven't seen in the West yet developed is are traditions that really sort of do the full spectrum of that well. And so I think this is a real growth opportunity for the world and for everything out there to incorporate like basic things like childhood and adult development and the skillful coping mechanisms and more, cognitive behavioral therapy or dialectical, whatever, like these kinds of things and neurofeedback and, that with this kind of deep stuff, because a lot of these people think if they just do enough of this, they can do it, they will do it, and it'll do this. I'm not sure that like sitting quietly, not talking to other people in a very calm, blissful state of mind necessarily helps you with road rage on the highway when you're driving in traffic. Like these are kind of radically different skill sets in some ways and radically different environments and kind of conditioning. I use the analogy all the time Like if you have like piano players and authors, both of them hit keys that have, letter labels in sequences designed to evoke specific stories and people, things in people and according to familiar arcs of tension and release of story, and so of course you would expect great authors to be great piano players and great piano players to be great authors. And yet how often is this true? I don't know if there's any data on this, but I would expect not that often, right? And on and so why would someone who can sit deeply in a high degree of quiet, isolated from other people, or dissecting the reality into its moment to moment experience, necessarily be highly skilled at dealing with their childhood traumas and parental relationships and attachment disorders? Like, how do those things seem related to each other? Not. Like maybe a teeny little bit in terms of like some, metacognitive skills, but like in other ways seem very distinct. And so I think this notion that this is all what it's about, and that will, or that this is all what it's about, and then you can do this and it'll solve that. I think that we need to get over ourselves and imagine and lose that sort of weird orthodox idealism and naivete that we've come into these meditative and contemplative traditions with. Okay, that's my whole rant on that. You've heard it now.
Yeah, like this sounds as if you're saying that these two things are completely orthogonal, when I actually thought like with these practitioners from like various traditions seem to think that they sort of point in the same direction. You're arguing they're orthogonal, and I think they point in opposite directions
Oh,
or almost opposite
nice.
directions.
I
And
like it. I think assuming orthogonality is safer than assuming that meditative development will necessarily translate to make you a better person in ordinary, complicated daily life psychological situations, right? But the talk more about the antithetical because I think that's really, really interesting. And I certainly see some of that of people who like
yeah.
the more they practice, the less they're able to function in society. I mean, that's the whole reason for the whole
Mm.
monastic thing, right? Like if you become a super deep meditator, maybe like you just need to be taken care of and not have a job and responsibilities and kids, because like how's that gonna go? So there is this sort of even baked into the original structure of Buddhism, maybe a tacit or implicit acknowledgement that there might be an antithetical nature to these two modes of development. What do you think?
Yeah, like for me, this just ties in with this theory that we're basically undoing the development of selfhood, and it certainly has some sort of purpose. Like otherwise, not everyone would like try to learn this as a child in the first 2 years. Um, and if we undo that, we're undoing something that's like very integral to our functioning in society. Maybe once we've actually had it for a decade, for a few decades, and we've learned from it, when we've like integrated all sorts of habits of how to relate to the world, then maybe we don't strictly need it anymore all the time. But at least having had it for a long enough time to build the habits seems very important to me. And
This is a
yeah,
commonly
so.
stated model that I think is a
Mm,
very, very good working theory. I think I don't have great data on this, but I would bet that at least some substantial portion of what you're saying
mm.
is useful and true in some
Hence why I
relative
think
way.
that it's, yeah, that it points in opposite directions. That it's just potentially detrimental unless you have a sufficiently strong basis and habits already built up.
Yeah, I think that some of the best explanatory theories for why the Dark Knight is really scary and sometimes challenging for people is it is deeply violating the sense of self that they have carefully cultivated for all of their life,
Yeah.
the sense of control, the sense of identity, the sense of what in the hell is this, the sense of, oh, I'm a good person, the sense of I'm in control, the sense of there is meaning. It can make reality very chaotic and meaningless and confusing, jarring. So yeah, that deeper layer stuff, when people hit that, it can be pretty awful. Even if they were, I've known some people who like seemed to, for every, according to every functional measure, to be highly integrated, self-actualized, extremely capable, professional, well-adjusted people who, when they crossed the A and P and hit the dark night, and it shattered all of that, and they friggin' freaked out and got suicidal or hyperreactive or very projecty or whatever it is. So yeah,
Mm.
I think there's something in what you're saying.
Hmm. Yeah.
I have like a thought about this, like a little pet theory of mine is so children develop like start developing the sense of self, or we don't know. We kind of think around two, around the time that they start recognizing themselves in the mirror. And most people have a memory break. Even children will have a memory break. Like a 5-year-old will not be able to go back to memories of a 1-year-old. And I almost wonder how much a sense of self is the scaffolding upon which we learn from experience, because psychopaths famously do not learn from experience. My girlfriend and I call it psychopath stupid when we do something like this. So we like
Oh,
miss our flight. We were supposed to fly to Paris on one day. We're getting ready for the flight the next day, and then I'm like, uh-oh, I think we've done something wrong here. I think we were supposed to fly out yesterday. Stuff like that, where you're just like, it's a little too jangly of a kind of a way to live life. And I wonder, often wonder, why is that? Why is it that psychopaths have, I struggle with it all the time, have such a hard time learning from experience, will keep repeating the same mistake over
hmm.
again. It's like the thing did not exist. And that's why I think the sense of self helps to make the things seem like it did exist, like have that sense of either continuity of the past into the future that you're in, or the sense that something hurt you, and that hurt requires you then to kind of like make adaptations to your construct of the world, so that you avoid the hurt in the future. And so I sometimes wonder, with like when you get to this place of like nonsense of self, just listening to you guys talk about Buddhism, which don't know as much about, like, is that one of the kind of issues? Is it that people can get there and kind of like be in such a like a mirror smooth place that stuff doesn't really stick anymore, and they like things matter less?
So my friends who and I who claim various levels of awakening, again, the Orthodox people are freaking out. Sorry, they memory issues are mentioned as a huge thing, like because things are so ephemeral, so transient, and so non-sticky,
Hmm.
like that just don't remember. Like it didn't land. It didn't have enough charge in it to stick as an amygdala thing that the amygdala wanted to remember, or the thalamus or whatever. Like where you kind of have to have things have to have enough emotional charge to kind of stick. And if they don't, they just kind of don't. And so this sort of floatiness or it's like slipperiness, or what was it called? You used a word there, of like it's kind of sketchy, or I can't remember. You used a word,
Jangly.
something
Ephemeral?
jangly. That's the
Jang-
word, jangly. Like where things are just moving through, and you just kind of like it doesn't like cohere to like I have to keep very elaborate to-do lists, or I can't remember what in the world I'm supposed to do. I have to take elaborate notes during meetings, or like stuff doesn't like it doesn't land, but I'm so I take a lot of notes. And uh a bunch of my friends who have done a whole lot of meditative practice, and reality is just sort of here and very transient and non-sticky and just flowing through. Also, I should mention that's routinely mentioned as an acquired taste, like,
Hmm.
and that sense of things being insubstantial or moving through or out of your control. Like, there's something really disconcerting about that, right? And I can understand this if like you have an increased appreciation or sensitivity or like awareness of like how not fun that can sort of be. Like that is a thing, and that's one of the primary barriers to a lot of people waking up is that sort of, oh my God, it's too slippery, it's too like just here, it's not sticky enough, it doesn't cohere to a sense of a me or an I, and they want a landing place, they want a platform to stand on from which they feel in control or stable or make any sense at all. And that's a real issue for a lot of people along the path. So being able to just flow into the unfolding weirdness, naturalness, slipperiness is a very acquired taste. It's like giving espresso to 2-year-olds, like they're not going to like it. And most people never like it. And we're in a society that says you should be in control, you should be a stable, you should be a person, you should be a have a reputation and a plan, and this is
Mm.
very much just like a flowing natural, like non-graspable thing. It can be eerie.
Yeah. I've had
So
this a lot with my nonverbal thoughts. Like most of the time, I would assume I don't subverbalize my thoughts. I just sort of think and thought stuff. Sometimes I have a bit of synesthesia, so I sort of have some visual associations with some of my thoughts. But later, they're so hard. Like if it weren't for the synesthesia, I'd have such a hard time like remembering these nonverbal thoughts. They're not visual, they're like basically nothing. Nothing that I could like
Wow.
describe in terms of senses. And
But
yeah,
you know
so
you're
just
having them,
trying to,
so there's some marker by which you know you have them, some subtle something, right? There's
yeah,
got to
so
be
I,
something sensate, or you wouldn't know you're having them.
like after I've had a thought, there is like some sort of echo, and this echo then usually has some haptic qualities. It's probably the synesthesia, has some haptic qualities. It has some sort of visual qualities. It's usually sort of bluish on black background or something. And
Nice.
but like I know those are just sort of synesthetic metaphors or something. And
It's good
yeah, but
microphenomenology, actually. I like it.
and yeah, so that, but yeah, those things are like really hard to remember. And I have this, like what you said about memory, this idea that if someone is like in some sort of very intense and very specific emotional state, this may be sort of like the psychic equivalence on mentalizing mode that some people enter when they have like personality disorders and they're like in some triggered state. That in that state, they have some emotion, they experience certain things that sort of make sense to that person in that state. But when they're not in that state anymore, it becomes extremely hard for them to access those memories again. And I imagine that could also happen to practitioners that if they're in some very intense state and they experience something and then they're not in the state anymore, then they don't have access to that anymore because it's sort of encoded such that the brain can read those memories when the brain is in that state. So maybe if they enter the state again, then perhaps they can remember the previous times that they've been in there, but like once they leave it again, they can't remember again. And so
Particularly if they don't have language for it. So the word
yeah.
ineffable, like indescribable, gets thrown around a lot. But if you haven't been trained in like the phenomenological description of very abstract or,
Mm,
nebulous or far out there states, they are harder to remember because you don't have the mental labely memory capacity. That is a true thing. Um,
mm. Yeah,
yeah,
I wonder where the synesthesia helps with like remembering weird stuff. And one of
definitely.
my one of my partners also has this thing where she thinks verbally. You would think in spoken words, but no, it's actually written words in her mind, and
Wow.
it's so crazy. But like, it probably helps a lot with like keeping some sort of objective memory as she transitions through different emotional states. And like she actually has like really strong emotions and lots of them all the time. Whereas I have like relatively few, like she says, like five or so overlapping somatic emotions every hour. And she says like five per day is normal. And I have maybe, I don't know, a couple per month or so. Like I have lots of emotions, but they're not so intense that I would perceive them somatically. And usually they're also sort
Interesting.
of a bit distant. I can sort of look at them, consider them. And like sometimes I get angry and I'm sort of amused by this weird state because I don't get angry very often. And so
Wild.
it's
It
like
would
I
be
have sort
very
of
interesting to go through a whole phenomenological discussion with you at some point, just of like what it's like to be you, as Emmy's question.
yeah,
Um,
we can do that. And but like, I would like to get more access to like sometimes my emotions are so brief that like sort of I have like this bit of synesthesia then, but I don't really have the time, like a couple seconds or so. I don't have the time to really understand what they are or what they're trying to tell me. And
Very
there I would like
interesting.
to, yeah, I don't know, do I need to speed up my perception or something to be able to perceive these emotions more in more a fine-grained fashion while they are there? Or how do I go about that to understand them better?
Well, the simple fact that you could notice them last for just a few seconds is already an unusual level of sensory capacity, right? And metacognitive capacity. I mean, that in of itself is very interesting. And to sort of give practice advice or what might be developed or what might be a good idea usually is better in the context of much more formal, like sort of diagnostic conversations, like everything else that's going on with a person and their cognitive and personality capacities and goals. And like that's actually like it's very hard to do that skillfully and well with only a little bit of information, right? It's usually
Mm-hmm.
better done. Oh, and that reminds me, speaking of a little bit of information, one of the funny things that gets thrown around a lot now in mindfulness circles is this concept of like, what is equanimity and what is dissociation? So like there's a book, Trauma Sensitive Mindfulness, for people who want more on this, which is kind of based on, it's the work of David Treleaven and Willoughby Britton, and it's based on the book The Body Keeps the Score, like with the sense of, and trauma, a lot of trauma awareness stuff. And the idea is that dissociation and equanimity can look a lot alike, or dissociation and not really noticing if you're having feelings or not really having feelings?
Mm.
Is that equanimity or spiritual attainment, or dissociation like numbness and trauma blocking or something, right? And untangling which or both like can be sort of complicated and sometimes take some time. And like, not that dissociation can't be adaptive or protective or useful, it can be. And this sort of funny discussion that hasn't really fully happened yet, at least in Buddhist circles, of the old text. If you look at these old books up here, they routinely talk about like dissociating from reality and experience, like dispassion towards like excluding, like not being interested in experience is usually is from a so like Theravada monastic point of view, really sort of like hyped as a generally a very good thing without any apparent well, it's got this sort of question of like what's equanimity versus what's indifference. These are not quite the same thing, obviously, sort of probably relevant to a discussion of psychopathy as well. Like these, this fine grain. So indifference is considered the near enemy of equanimity, like it's sort of deadened, numb imposter, whereas equanimity is very full spectrum and everything is allowed to flow through very easily, whereas indifference is kind of like cold or heartless or sort of flat, like seems very similar, but actually is kind of, yeah, near enemy, different. So those kinds of considerations might be interesting to put into the mix when discussing, like maybe, and then there's no atypicality, which was sort of like you can kind of find some hints of it back in the day in Buddhism, but like I think we've done a lot better with regards to that kind of stuff in this current age. And some people may just be wired to experience or have very emotions very differently. And what is attainment to genuine transformation? Like if you have gone far down the path, emotions may move through very, very quickly, seem like almost nothing in comparison to the grand field of all of the experience of the room and the colors and the textures. And by the way, there's a little something here that I guess you could call an emotion, but like it's already gone, like, and it was already shifting. And why? Like, is it like it's 0.0001% of the vast volume of experience? Is it even really that relevant or interesting? I don't know, maybe kind of like, but maybe not that big a deal. And so these sorts of questions are still being debated, and to do it for a person really requires helping to tease some of that stuff out.
Mhm. Can you recommend something, some resources or whatever, on how to tell this difference between dissociation, indifference, equanimity, and so on?
Wow. I think Trauma Sensitive Mindfulness is just a cool and interesting book for people who are going to get into meditation, particularly in a mental
Mm.
healthy sort of context, because we all have our traumas and our issues and our scarific. Emmy, you were talking about like scarification, like this sort of way that's in the Dark Finds podcast. You were talking about how psychopaths sort of like challenge the world and like knock it out of its slumber and like make it look at itself and kind of wake up. And there's a through scarring the grass or whatever, you get more
Yeah.
growth, right? There's sort of almost like a decompositional aspect, like or something. And um just thinking about that in the context of like trauma and how we all have our sort of traumas and our issues, like sorting that out is really complicated. So I'm not a trauma informed therapist, so I don't want to like overstep my my professional or training capacities. But starting with Trauma Sensitive Mindfulness by David Treleaven and Willoughby Britton would be really an interesting sort of basic foundational start, and like seeing some of the symptoms of what's dissociation versus what might be meditative attainment. And this is slippery and gray, so there's a lot of nuanced
Mm.
work that has not really been done yet on this, and I think needs to be. So if people out there are psychology students and are trying to figure out, you want a cool PhD thesis to figure out how to sort that out, like that would be great if there's a scale or nuanced or neuroimaging or something, because I don't think it's always so straightforward.
Yeah, so the distinction. Sorry, did you want to say something?
Yeah,
Do you?
keep following yours. I want to follow up with
Okay.
indifference and maybe talk about, if you guys can help me
Uh-huh.
remember this time,
Okay. Yeah.
talk about your different forms of psychopaths.
Ah, yeah, I just wanted to like quickly mention like I find it super interesting to try to, or I would find it super interesting to try to find out what the difference is between like there's other specified dissociative disorder and it has a subform 1A where the distinctions between the alters, so it is kind of similar to dissociative identity disorder, but like less overt switching and so on. And specifically in the 1A form, there is amnesia, but there are like no particularly distinctive alters. And that seems to me super similar to the type of thing that goes on with people with borderline and with pathological narcissism, who also in their triggered states do things and then often don't remember them or find it like very odd when they see, then when they have like some visual memories maybe coming in that don't make sense to them from their current emotional state, but something that they apparently have done. And like all sorts of weird memory phenomena, sort of like amnesia there, but also when it comes to other specified dissociative disorders. So, like, what's the distinction? Is that the same thing, or is that something completely different? It just looks similar, and yeah. So that is something that I would find super interesting to read more about, see more studies on.
Right. Yeah. Dissociation has a sort of a generally kind of a Jonicky quality to it. That's the funny thing, like of dissociating from memory or dissociating from a situation or even dissociating from what you're saying or what you're doing. Right. And jhanas in the same way are dissociating maybe from body or mind or
Mm,
feelings or certain negative qualities. Right. So that's the funny thing, right? There is this sort of at least superficial and maybe deeper layer of similarity of the capacity of the mind to include or to exclude. In one case,
mm,
when under stress and triggered. In another case, intentionally cultivated in theoretically very skillful meditative context. But I think the underlying mechanisms of how you include or exclude aspects of experience
mm,
is functionally has got to be the same. I mean, it's got to be some of the same default mode network switching circuitry that is at work in both. And there might often sometimes be some like overlap, and that they're both kind of protective, or they might be make people feel better about what's going on.
mm,
Like both have a similar kind of root function in some ways, even if they might be very
mm,
different functionally in a social context or from arising from different circumstances. So in the same way that the stages of insight look like bipolar, the variants of dissociation look a lot like
mm,
some meditative jhanic attainments, like, and also like getting into states you can't remember. So that's also a thing. Like there are states where there's no obvious way to remember them because there wasn't really anything there to remember. So
mm.
like that's commonly reported. Like I don't know what that was. 10 minutes just gone. I wasn't asleep. I didn't wake
Yeah.
up, but like there's just nothing there. And it's kind of feels very dissociative. So like untangling this again, like those of you out there in academic land, if they're PhD psychologists or research psychologists or
Yes,
neuroscientists
please.
watching this, please help lend your research power to sorting out these fascinating questions. We need more help on this.
Yeah, just quickly, like, I think that makes sense to distinguish a dissociation with regard to memory, like how someone like looks back on things versus like perception at the time. I think when it comes to perceptions at the time, like, there's like this distance that I described where I can sort of observe my emotions and then have some meta emotions about my like object level
Mm.
emotions and so on. But then when it comes to memory, I get this feel like this thing that I mentioned earlier, where someone can go into some very intense state of grandiosity, for example, and then not remember some vulnerable states or vulnerable emotions that they had. That is like one thing that people do, but then there's also this thing that they do where, like, for example, they feel anger, but like very quickly override that with humiliation, or they feel humiliation and very quickly override that with anger. And
I think that's the more
that way
common one.
they I did the first one.
Oh,
And
okay. Oh,
I'm weird. And so like they sort of like perceive it briefly, but then sort of push it away so quickly that they don't remember afterwards. And so I feel like these are very different types of dissociation. Would you agree?
sure. Yeah, I think mapping all of that out is worthy of good study, and I love taxonomies, intricate taxonomies of these sorts of things.
Hmm? Yeah, cool. But Jamie, you had some
Yeah,
straight
I
up
love
questions?
taxonomies too.
Yeah, thank you.
So I thought that with this idea of like the indifference versus the equanimous kind of distinction, I had like a thought about these people who have like some sort of like thought, like their experience, their self-described experience is that they became a psychopath in puberty. And I think I've only talked to like one, maybe two or three people that are like this, but it is true. Like if people like want to look in the Zoom at the Australian dude who's in his 20s that was like back in like 2021, he experienced this like as a result of kind of his parents' divorce or whatever. And I wonder if those people, if they experience more indifference, and people like me, like Daniel, I'm not sure if you like have stumbled upon this experience of mine, but when I was an infant, I had colic. And they
Hmm.
would put me in a room and just like leave me crying. They would say I cried like 23 hours a day and there was nothing. And my mom suffered a
Oh my
nervous
God.
breakdown as a result. So I'm like, it
Oh
kind of
my
seems like it
God.
kind of started somewhere in there, like earlier than like my
Wow.
girlfriend is what it seems like. And
Hmm.
the earlier it seems, the more you seem like equanimous, like me, like everything's just happening. And the later it seems, the more it's indifference in the psychopaths. And so maybe
Huh.
this kind of like explains, Don, some of the difference between
Mm.
the psychopaths is that you see like this and the indifference to me seems to be like a judgment. You're perceiving the thing, you sense it as like a self kind of, and then you just say I'm not interested kind of. Whereas the like my experience is more like I don't tend to have like that kind of judging trait of I in it. It's just like a more pure experience than it seems to be in the other psychopaths that I meet. And it seems like the indifference ones also I could see how, for instance, I don't experience any, is it misanthropic? Like I'm not misanthropic, really, but I meet other psychopaths who are, and I wonder if some of that kind of comes in where indifference. I seem to think that's more on the side of being misanthropic, whereas you just have like no self there, but there's no, because of that, there's no real judgment kind of happening, or no kind of like or
Mm.
dislike even, above just like the most kind of like primitive urges.
Yeah, that sort of
Mm.
non-judgmental quality or apparent non-judgmental quality of you, Emmy, is one of the more interesting of the qualities that I pick up on in your work. So, yeah, very interesting. An interesting theory about when it might arise. I wonder if that's testable on broader population samples of when people's, if you think it's sort of injury based, like based on like, neglect as an infant with colic or whatever, like then, or like sort of wound based, like from something that happened in childhood, that kind of theory. I wonder if there's a way to test that. There probably is. I would love to see data on that. That's a really interesting theory.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Daniel.
I actually have like two friends who experience sadism, and I think one of them is um, has the first type of psychopathy, and the other one has the other type of psychopathy that
Mm.
develops later in life.
Hmm.
But maybe they are just completely different types of sadism, so it's also
Well, I
possible.
think, I mean, anybody who's been on a playground in junior high school, like all kids are, or a lot of kids are at least a little bit sadistic or cruel or something. There's
Mm.
something about the junior high school years, like, you know, it's like, I think sort of general psychopathy or just sort of functional psychopathy is more prevalent in those years anyway.
Mhm.
Like if people who were kind of like more normal during the latent phase of like 6 to 10 or something, like people become 12, 13, 14, and you get to see all the complicated playground dynamics and all of that. It feels like it's always felt way more sort of cluster B-ish. Like that's kind of a phase when like that's much more seemingly prevalent in in that age range that it is in some other age ranges, just you know so I wonder if that somehow can get locked in or amplified like by the circumstances that happen at that phase for
Hmm.
people.
Yeah.
Speaking of
Yeah, there is
developmental
like
models,
Yeah,
there
what do
is a
you
love
study
it.
on that that I've seen. Mm.
What were you
Yeah,
saying,
there's
Don? Go ahead.
I just said I've seen a study on that confirmed that there's some kind of correlation between um, whether someone goes in the direction of grandiose pathological narcissism or vulnerable pathological narcissism, depending on their like high school experience around puberty with
Mm.
peers, where the ones that are more socially successful go in the grandiose direction, and the ones who are not go in the vulnerable direction. But it's just like correlational. So it could be just
Mhm.
that some people are more introverted, and so have like both matching experiences with few friends and vulnerable narcissism, and yeah, others are more extroverted, and then accordingly. So no idea which way around it is.
Do you have more questions, Don?
I think did you listed two, I think, earlier, and I think
No,
you've
I'm done.
asked
I'm
one.
good.
Okay. Yeah, so I have plenty more questions. Um, there is actually a whole new section that I wanted to touch on, if you want to, Danielle, about
Sure.
like altruism as effective or as efficient as possible, and about like the role of empathy in that, because it seems to me that empathy is kind of wasted on most of humanity. They're not really doing much with it. Like,
You mean they have empathy and then it doesn't drive them to the degree of altruistic action you would expect?
yeah, exactly. Like, I have these statistics. They're like um, 8 billion humans. They're like 2 to the 2 times 10 to the 10 livestock. They're like 10 to the 12 mammals, and 10 to the 19 terrestrial arthropods. And so, like, lots and lots of beings. They're potentially sentient. They're potentially, yeah, like,
And
have
we farm them,
some.
we eat them, we destroy their habitats, we are
Exactly.
demolishing the
And
planet, we're creating the sixth great extinction, 150 species die a day, to give us our lattes from across the world or whatever, and our
yeah.
somethings,
And
right?
whether
Is
someone.
society intrinsically just, despite all its empathy, really
Exactly.
fucking psychopathic from any sort of global
Exactly. Yeah.
ecological point of view and all our notions that we're not, oh, those are the psychopaths and we're not, like, no, we're burning the freaking planet to the ground, right? We are slaughtering countless species as fast as we can go and for our delectation and amusement and uh yeah, good.
Exactly, like the average psychopath, like cares about maybe like one, two, three people that are close to them, maybe zero in some cases, not even themselves. And like the average person who has effective empathy cares maybe about 100 people in their vicinity, and it just doesn't make a big difference in the scheme of things. And how do we change that? Like, how do we get people to actually use this, like either use this effective empathy that they have, or just like double down more on the cognitive empathy and try to really understand what follows from that? And
Nice. Well, I want to like propose a sort of like just something that just popped into my mind. Me, you were talking about that need for meaning and how the institute itself might be really good for psychopaths, the very psychopaths it was designed to prevent. I wonder if there's a way to mobilize the power of psychopathy to save the planet. Like that
Mm.
sounds like a really sort of like potentially dangerous or crazy thing to do if you just hear it on the face of it. But
We'll
I
call it
wonder,
the Institute.
there you go, right? Exactly. So we're like, but if they're looking for meaning and if they're looking to be okay and they're willing to do what it takes and they find it all sort of, sometimes amusing or like whatever, I wonder if there isn't there isn't an untapped potential resource there. I mean, like actually, we already kind of do this, right? So like surgeons who are really good surgeons because they don't feel anything of the patient's pain when they're cutting or doing whatever procedure they're doing, and it allows them to focus on their technical craft. Or lawyers who are able to represent criminals because it's just a role for them and they're good at manipulation and they can get paid good money for that and they like that. And so like that is in some ways adaptive, right? Like, or CEOs or corporate raters who are good at corporate rating or running companies because they can just fire a bunch of people and it's like just what needs to happen. And it doesn't,
Mm.
cause them, the same kind of disquietude it might cause someone who's like thinking about their families and whether or not they can feed their children in the same kind of way. So like there are these examples of adaptation that you mentioned, like, in some of your other work. I wonder if there isn't a way like this, what I call the paladin problem. So, like in my Institute podcast, like the idea of the paladin, the righteous knight who happens to be really good at doing things and killing people and just happens to pray to God that they will save the souls of whoever they had to slay, the Black Knight or the dragon or whatever, this comes out of chivalry and stuff. And they're sort of on the side of good, but from all functional other purposes, they just happen to have a lot of really well developed, capable, psychopathic killing, um, doing stuff, James Bondy or whatever kind of traits. I
Mm.
wonder if there isn't some way to rechannel like the capacities of psychopaths towards saving the planet. Like if they're going to be selfish, maybe they just be wisely selfish and even save themselves. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I have like a quick thought on this, and I think that it's like maybe not enough. The psychopaths are not a big enough proportion of the population. And people talk about, oh, they have all this control. I personally am like, I don't think they have control. People are always telling me, like, oh, Elon Musk has so much control and influence. And I'm like, really? If he does, I mean, he has like what he has is still a drop in the bucket, I guess. He has a bigger drop, a much bigger drop than I do, but it's still a drop in the bucket. And so I often think about this, but I think kind of what the issue is, my own theory, having watched people with empathy behave over my almost 45 years of existence, is there something about this word that you used, disquietude, that I think is like the bump, their bump that they have from going from the empathy to the action or something. There's something about like if you make a choice that's different than the one you made yesterday, did that make the choice from yesterday be wrong? And so this resistance to change because of the disquietude they feel, and possibly having to reevaluate themselves from good person to bad person. And it's interesting when you look at change, let's say like transgender rights. Before, people had their beliefs about transgender rights. Now they have different ones, and they don't have like really a memory of what they had before, it seems like. Let's look at gay marriage. You have like people like, let's say Hillary Clinton or whatever, Barack Obama, who opposed gay marriage at one point, maybe for just political reasons, but then changed. And people just kind of pretend like the change never happened, like they never were the person who had the previous beliefs. And if you can do that, if you can, it seems like the empathy people need this. They need that memory break, the same way that we have a memory break from we don't remember into our infancy. And I don't know why that seems to kind of free them up to do things differently, the memory break, but it seems like that's the one thing when you guys have been talking about the Dark Knight or whatever, after the rise fall. I'm trying to pick up on the words, the terminology, but I don't think the psychopaths like this sense of like reevaluating yourself and thinking that you're a bad person. Luckily, that's just probably not either that's not something the psychopaths would do, or for the rest of the cluster Bs, they're already thinking they're a bad person. BPD people think they're a bad
Mm.
person. Narcissists think they're a bad person. So it's something that I think is hard because it gets back to this idea that I suggested below. Whereas I can tell, unlike other people, I don't think of humanity in terms of a hierarchy of worth. I think it's flat, and that there's not baddies that deserve the worst that we can give them, and there's not goodies. It's all just humanity, and that it's like every little piece is the same basically, and that there's not a hill or something that it's on. And I think that when you believe that there's a hierarchy and that you're on the top of the hierarchy, that's really dangerous because I think you fear dropping down in the hierarchy. You fear it more than you fear existential threats
Which
like
is
the
sort of
the planet.
inevitable, right? Because aging and change, like at some point, you're going to drop out of the hierarchy through some process.
Yeah, except my baby boomer parents, they're like freaked out by it. They're like in a tailspin because they know that they're not relevant anymore, that nobody cares what they think.
Well, that was a pretty narcissistic generation. So, like, would it be weird for me to reframe what you just said and see if this is a reasonable reframing in some way?
Do it.
That an empathetic person actually needs to suffers a shame wound that they then narcissistically sort of dissociate from and can't deal with. So they need to dissociate from a memory in the same way the narcissist would. So basically, empathy that requires a continuity of belief or a low tolerance for change, which would then seem like hypocrisy, functionally then becomes some sort of dissociative narcissism. Is
Yeah,
that
I
kind of
love
what you,
that
did you just
because
say
if
that?
if you ask psychopaths what they think of like normal people, hypocrite is like the primary thing. Like we can't avoid seeing it because we don't have that same narcissistic wound that we're trying to cover. And so it's like we just see you guys doing all this stuff and we're like, you guys are nuts. Like you guys think
Yeah,
it
exactly.
reminds me of the prison scene in The Watchmen, where he's like, "You guys think I'm stuck in here with you? You're stuck in here with me." That's how we feel. You guys aren't stuck on this world with us, the psychopaths. We're stuck on this world with you. That's how it feels.
Wow, nice.
Yeah,
That's
there's
hilarious.
there's this thing in like psychodynamic psychology where they have like forgetting the terms, but like different positions that people take when they are in this borderline level of personality organization. They can still do all sorts of things, like you just described, with like rewriting memories and dissociating from stuff, and then not remembering that they used to hold a different position, and thinking that they've always believed what they currently believe,
I think all of
and.
politics plays to this. Like the news cycles are so fast
Uh-huh.
now. No, like the Republican Party, does it even know what it believed like 5 years ago under Reagan? Like it looks totally different. So I'm getting political,
But I
right?
would have
Like, and
thought like,
politicians play to this where people can't remember what they were and they just need a new message that fits with the times and makes things make sense through their lens, and they just rapidly readapt in ways that are totally hypocritical.
but I
Democrats
would have
too. I'm not
thought that
singling out any party here.
yeah, of course. I would have thought that like most people operate on the neurotic level and not on the borderline level. And on the neurotic level, it's like marked by like what's called the depressive position, because now people have to actually face the like the like changing of their opinions, and that they were wrong in the past and they've changed their opinion. They cannot rewrite the past anymore. They cannot like yeah, all sorts of things that they can do in the borderline range of personality organization are not no longer open to them, because they have like reality checking now. And I would have thought that most people operate on that level, and so have to cultivate such things as self-compassion, for example, that they like don't feel a lot of shame over their past mistakes, but they forgive themselves and move on and endorse their new position. And so, like, I would have thought that that is a bit more common, but maybe it's not. What do you think?
I think the hypocrisy you're pointing out, Emmy, is extraordinarily real. Like anybody who's done a whole bunch of inner work, or like certainly you get to see it in meditation and very much in psychedelics, like you will get to see all these kind of parts. So like bringing in internal family systems, which we haven't really talked about in parts, like or bringing in Freud, like you will see your id, which is a terrifying lizard brain thing that wants to kill and rape and steal and like, and then you will see the internal super parent that is totally embarrassed by this thing, and you get to be the poor schmo ego in the middle, like caught between these like irreconcilable forces and tensions in some ways from a very Freudian point of view. And I would suspect that psychopaths may be more sort of intrinsically aware of what their id is like if they have less narcissism, as you were talking about, I think, in the Dark Finds podcast. Like shadow work is like something that narcissists do because they like split off from their lizard brain or whatever, that I'm being totally coarse here, that they didn't want to integrate, that just wants to do really primal things. And psychopaths might be like, hey, why are you all not talking about wanting to do primal things. This is really obvious to us, and we see it in all of you. And you just have managed to get a really strong super parent that can like mask or sublimate or redirect or ignore or deny or whatever that. And yet your societies, you're still totally fucking killing people and genocides and nuclear weapons and like doing totally psychopathic shit. And you're all like thinking you're the good people, like while you're eating all the animals and burning the planet to the ground. Like I get it, right? When I go to, I can't go to circling. Like, do y'all want to know what circling is or authentic relating? Like
Mm,
circling where you sit around and like you drop to this next level of sort of emotional realness and disclosure, but it has all these like very sort of unspoken boundaries and rules around it. Like, and you say like sort of very authentically what you're feeling, but it almost never, you're not allowed to go to actual lizard brain
Mm.
in either in your speech and certainly not in your actions, right? You couldn't just kill the person over there you didn't like and rape the person that you find very attractive or whatever your lizard brain wants to do. And they're like, oh, we're being so authentic. But
Mm.
if you're aware of like how powerful the lizard brain is and driving all of the stuff you see on the news and human behavior and consumerism, like I could see how like that sense of like scathing hypocrisy could be really like glaring to people who are more in touch with that side of themselves and kind of surprised that everybody else isn't and kind of like thinks like this is a problem. Like you hypocrites, like do you see what you're doing?
Yeah.
Right? Do you see the denial? Do you see the dissociation? Do you see how blind you are? I can see that. Did that resonate with you at all in some way?
Yeah. And Don, do you have thoughts on this? I have like another thought that might be a little bit of a tangent.
no, please go ahead.
So I almost wonder, like the thing that's kind of helped me to understand, let's say, because mob mentality has been something I've always been very, I mean, I say fearful of, just like knowing that it at any moment can like pop up out of nowhere and devour you, devour any of us. Whatever the
Hmm.
mob chooses is what the mob wills is what,
Devour whole countries.
yeah, devour whole countries. And you see so many good examples of it, even especially in the 20th century, I think. Um,
Oh
but
yeah.
but one thing that has helped me to kind of understand this is Girard. Are you familiar with Rene Girard, Daniel?
Oh yeah, the one Peter Thiel is super influenced, even though seems to kind of get some parts wrong. But please continue. And
I don't
my
know
guess
Peter
is,
Thiel.
oh, Peter Thiel, a Palantir, JD Vance's backer, like
Okay.
Sci Politics. Anyway, never mind.
Yeah.
But yeah, a lot of the neo-reactionaries very into Gerard. But please continue, like talking about scapegoats and
And
all that.
yeah, yeah,
Like you
scapegoats, exactly. And I just kind of think like I still need to get through like the whatever lecture series I'm in or something, but his idea that like how can we kind of like get from what we did yesterday to doing something different today? I think it's really interesting. He has an interesting answer,
should.
which is like prehistorically or like pre-Christ, I guess he says, is that we use a scapegoat and we're just like, oh, this person was to blame for the things yesterday. Not us, but we do have to make somebody to blame. And it's this person. Then we kill the scapegoat. Then we can move on and enter a new world, not burdened by our past. So my whole thing to people is just don't be burdened by your past. I wish I could somehow
And then you don't
teach or
have to kill
impart
people.
that. Yeah, you don't have to be burdened by your past. You can't change your past. There's no reason to feel burdened by it except to the extent that we've been kind of talking about, which is learning from experience maybe, and like the scarification process, and like the more you kind of get roughed up by the past, what the past was there for. When you make mistakes, you learn from the mistakes. It doesn't have to be this moral thing. And the moral reasoning, to me, I don't understand it. It freaks me out. Even I'm like a little bit freaked out by moral reasoning of any type,
Well,
because I
I
see
mean,
it being weirdly used and like mostly ignored, mostly just used to justify harming others is the way I see it. But I just wish that would be my solution though, Don, to all the problems is don't be burdened by your
Mm,
past, and we can do something different today that's completely different.
God, yeah, I have this
wow,
problem all the
that's
time.
powerful.
I totally agree. Like, I have this problem all the time that I'm talking with people in like their narcissistic collapse, for example,
Mm,
um, who are like who have such a hard time. accepting like their core shame, accepting some things that they've done that they regret. And it takes such a long time for them to work through that. But I also have some other friends who have like more psychopathic traits who have a really easy time with this acceptance. And I'm always like, if only I could put these two people next to each other and then like the osmosis could start and like they would reach some like good level of self-acceptance and it would make things so much easier. I think really think like self-compassion and self-acceptance and self-forgiveness like so key to recovery from pathological narcissism. And
Mm,
it's also so hard for a lot of people.
yeah.
And societies as well. Like societies are
Yeah.
pathologically narcissistic, right? I mean,
Hmm.
like extremely, nationalism looks like narcissism to me,
Mm.
like almost
Yeah,
one
I'm
to one.
sure.
Yeah, that sort of thing of like revolution. So I think the question of revolution is an interesting one that's being raised a lot these days in civil war. Like people who think there's something really wrong in society, they feel like there's something very problematic, immoral, or unjust, or whatever. And then how does one instigate revolution without potentially doing something that feels kind of psychopathic and against their highly civilized nature? Like that kind of conflict must seem to a psychopath like very hypocritical,
Mm.
you know?
I actually have not encountered people who maybe I'm around people who have different moral values, but the people that I encounter who want revolution, other than Don, and I guess you, Daniel, want the bloody revolution. They want there to be retribution. They want
Mm,
it to be like, and these people, like people who are like, and let's just move on. They're like, no, people need to pay. And especially for whatever reason, the American election, this most recent American election, I saw so many instances of that where people were like, oh, now we can move on. And a lot of people in the comments and Twitter or whatever else being like, no, people need to pay. And I think that is the thing that freaks me out is the like I don't think psychopaths I mean psychopaths do have like their own form of retribution, but I think it's like a power they think there's a power imbalance and they fix the power imbalance. There's not like a moral judgment associated with it. Not at all.
interesting.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So it just freaks me out whenever there's a moral judgment because I most commonly see the moral judgment actually from people. It's so weird in terms of retribution. I see like probably 90% of the instances where I've seen somebody exercise a moral judgment, it's to, to do something bad to somebody and they deserve it because of retribution.
Mm.
Hmm.
Yeah, that pretty much always seems to go badly, right? Like there's this song "War Is Not Murder" by Jesse Wells
Mm,
that I really like, and it's talking about genocides and when one nation does something outrageously bad to another nation, we can think of examples in
yeah.
contemporary contexts,
I
and they're
will
like,
say it the
huh?
Israeli reaction to the Palestinians. I'm like, guys, what the heck? This is nuts. How can people be like, this is fine or whatever? It's nuts to me.
The whole thing is like,
Hmm.
but well, I mean, like, yeah, that could disentangling all of the countless slights across many decades on all sides is, that's could be a long conversation. But the consequence then being, if you take retribution, like the kids of these people will just see it as injustice,
Hmm.
right? And they will, in 20 years, you're going to have a problem, right? Because that trauma is going to come around. And if you like, sort of, there's this Buddhisty thing, or Jesus-y thing, an eye for an eye makes everybody blind. And, that if you find the first words of the Dhammapada, hate is never cured by more hatred. Hate is cured by love alone. And if you just keep wringing the karmic, violence into the world, the karmic violence will keep ringing on.
Yeah.
And so letting go of retribution does seem the only reasonable way out of the cycle, that you don't get all these traumatized, angry people who then go looking for traumatized, angry situations, and they're kids and whatever. So like, how do you stop the intergenerational trauma and violence while you're still in a retribution mode? Like regardless of whether or not you think retribution is just, which obviously I hear your arguments against the morality or the moral thinking at all of that as a category, like causally, functionally, even like it's probably not a good idea from a trauma psychology, what's going to happen in the next few decades point of view, you know?
Yeah. So just to be clear, I don't actually have a judgment against it. I am just
Oh, interesting.
describing it. Yeah,
Oh,
it's not
cool.
a
Got it.
normative. I'm not saying that you guys are hypocrites and it's bad or retribution's bad. I'm just saying when I see moral judgment, it's associated 90% from a descriptive point of view. But I also think my own perspective on this is like you've said, oh, it causes all these bad harms or whatever. I don't even think of it that way. I think of it in the
Interesting.
terms of like, why would I want to live my life in reaction to what others are doing all the time? That gives them power over me. There's no way that I would accept that as a psychopath, just being like, and my life's work now is to, you know, what is the verb of retribution? To retribute against the thing that you've done. Why would I let you dictate to me what I choose to do with my life? Why would I make my life's work about you? No, you're not important enough to me. I'm the most important thing. That's like the psychopath thinking
But
there.
it's got
That,
a
that
little bit of like like skillful narcissism or something in
yeah.
that. Like, is
But
there
it's
some
like, why would
self-actualized
you?
narcissistic something in that? Like reclaiming some of the self or no
Yeah,
something?
reclaiming. Yeah, and it's like there's no way that I would just react to people because like you don't matter to me enough to do that.
Nice.
So number one, number two, especially now that I have a sense of self, I think of like a good way of thinking about this is I treat people the way that I am in a form that's self-expression to me. I don't treat people like how they are. I don't go around making assessments of everybody being like good, bad, good, bad, good, bad. And so you're good, so I treat you good. You're bad, I treat you bad. That seems like so insane to me. There's like no words for how insane I feel like that way of living is. It's like number one, you want to spend all your time judging people good, bad, and if you treated somebody good badly, then only is that wrong? Or if you treat somebody bad good, then you think that's wrong too. I'm like, just treat people how you are. If you're generous, treat people generously. It's so weird. I think people are so afraid of being duped when, especially when they make this assessment of people when this is how they choose how to treat people when they're like, oh, I have to first judge them if they're good or bad, then treat them good if they're good, bad if they're bad, and then they worry about being tricked. Oh, you look good, but are you really bad and you're tricking me? And this fear of being duped is so weird to me. And
Hmm.
basically everybody has it, and I feel so badly for all of you because it seems to control, it has your balls in the vice grip. It seems like so much of your behavior can be explained by the fear of being tricked, of being duped, of being like manipulated or whatever. I see it all the time. I'm like, ugh, okay, it's not that bad. I'm duped all the time. I'm tricked. I don't care. Why care? I don't, what does it matter?
I'm reminded of the term sonder, comes from the Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows, and it's recognizing like the full unbelievable complexity of another human being in front of you, which would be that they're not good, they're not bad, they contain all of these things, is sort of the expansive or semi-empathetic version of kind of what you said. Like, are they good? Are they bad? They have everything within them. Is one of the things you get to recognize in meditation, actually. You get to see your inner psychopaths that could just totally fucking kill and screw people or whatever. And you get to see the parts of yourselves that are, very, very potentially different from that. You get to see all of it, right? So it's interesting. And then I was, oh god, the second thought may have disappeared. It'll come to me. Anyway, just that recognition of, but I think that that's a really interesting way to look at it. And there's a kind of a transcendence in that. Like from a spiritual point of view, it actually looks very transcendent. Not to glorify it, but it has that sense of beyond good and evil is something that routinely gets mentioned in spiritual circles and beyond judgment for other people. Oh yeah, the other thing is communism. So communism, like it is very, very rare to find someone who actually claims to be non-judgmentally egalitarian in that kind of way. And then that made me think, one of the routinely mentioned things about communism is that you can't have communism because the psychopaths will just take it over from the sheep or whatever, right? And that's what happened with Stalin, and that's what happened with like all the attempts at communist revolution, where like a bunch of narcissistic psychopaths jumped into the fray and grabbed control, and then it became an authoritarian, you know, shit show with gulags and whatever the hell, right? So, but weirdly enough, what you're saying is kind of the opposite of that. If everyone was psychopathic in the way you were, and you had this sort of egalitarianness of people, and there wasn't this hierarchy, you actually, if there were perhaps other, I don't know what other qualities you'd need on top of that, but to get to a true sense of an egalitarian society, people might need a little more of what, curiously enough, a self-avowed psychopathy or you is saying. That's usually not how communism is viewed. I was just thinking of the sort of shocking irony of that. Anyway,
I
my
bet the
thoughts.
psychopaths were
Yeah.
some of the first killed because they're not socialized. So they'll say something that's out of step and then they'll get killed. So I actually
Oh,
doubt that communism has a ton of psychopaths. Probably, as you say, like malignant narcissists, or I don't know what the words are. But I should say, you want to
well,
speak to that? Go ahead.
well, yeah, it's interesting because I've been kind of thinking that like the problem that needs to be solved to save the planet is our collective and individual psychopathy, right? But maybe it's our collective and individual narcissism is the greater threat.
Yeah.
Just as a work an interesting hypothesis. Sorry, you were going on. You were
Yeah. And,
saying,
and Don, did you have something on this? Because I was going to make a clarification that may be a tangent.
Hmm.
hmm,
Yes, but it's a little bit longer. So maybe the clarification can go first.
Yeah, I'll do this one first. So when I say judgment, I should say that I don't like I make a distinction between the words discern and judge. When I discern that you guys are being hypocritical, it has no normative judgment where I say bad. So it's mostly like I can say, hey, this person's not trustworthy because they rarely tell the truth, but there's not a bad attached to it. It's just like I don't trust this person says that they're going to do this and I will make other plans because I don't believe them. You know? So I still act in a discerning world in which I'm trying to track reality. I'm just not saying good or bad. Yeah, go ahead, Don.
Yeah, exactly. I'm
nice.
copying all of these things. I think I p picked them up in the Clearer Thinking interview that you gave, and
Yeah.
I've been trading them since then. It's been working extremely well. I'm like explicitly not being afraid anymore of, of being duped. And yeah, also just like non-judgmentally, just sort of adapting to how people behave, and then like drawing my boundaries accordingly or something. Yeah, that's just super relaxing. Yeah, like the other thing, like you mentioned retribution, and that's just extremely wasteful in my view. Like I've recently are you like there are some cool Facebook groups with like lots of people with psychopathy and pathological narcissism, other cluster Bs, all combinations, and so all sorts of questions of this sort come up quite a lot. And so like I was though thinking about like I never have this impulse to want to take revenge on someone because and I laid out like the game theory and like single shot games, iterated games, and like that didn't make sense to me. But then I figured, okay, I can try it out and found some like mild harmless example where I could try it out, and yeah, it was kind of pointless. I don't know, but like retribution is sort of like an extreme example. What a lot of activists do is that they have this what's called like narcissism of small differences or something,
Yes, that's a huge
where
thing in Buddhist and religious contexts.
yeah.
Oh my God, it is so awful. Like, please continue.
Yeah, it's like especially in my activist circles, like lots of people have sort of are like extremely aligned in what they want to achieve, but then they just sort of fight over some minor difference, and instead of like achieving anything, they're just fighting each other. That's also something like I've heard about this, like the some early theorists of intersectionality also noticed this and developed some of the intersectional thought on that basis. And some friends of like acquaintances slash friends of mine have written some papers on this. One person I don't really know that well is Eric Drexler. He has this idea of Paretotopia, and someone I know a bit better is Toby Ord. He has like a paper on moral trade, and they are basically transferring all sorts of knowledge from economics to morality to ethics,
Mm,
and yeah, basically creating like a kind of capitalism of ethics, wherein if you have like uh, two different like ideologies, then instead of like warring with each other to until like one of the ideologies wins, you trade with the other person
mm,
or with the other group. You try to figure out like what are all the like 90% of things that we agree on. Okay, let's implement those. With like the 10% of things where we disagree on, like how strongly disagree do we disagree on each of those? How contradictory are they? If they're not contradictory, let's just do both. If they are contradictory, let's see like how we value these relatively speaking, and then trade something that I don't value so much for something that I value the other person not doing strongly, and then we get like the typical gains from trade. When someone has like a ton of apples, they don't need that many apples. They don't value the marginal 100th apple very highly. So they can trade the marginal 100th apple for some money that someone else has who needs one apple and has zero apples and so values the apple really highly. And same thing we can apply to ethics, and so can get lots of activists with like all their slightly different opinions of what the world should be like to all cooperate towards some compromise goal, some like Pareto improvement over fighting it out. So like ideally you'd find like some Pareto optimal compromise between all of them and optimize for that. And Eric Drexler argues that that would be tremendously valuable. And that is also, yeah, that is something that I think lots of people who have like really strong righteousness and really strong, like very particular, narrow affective empathy or something are like really not thinking of. Like, it's just a huge opportunity for like growth and for the improvement of the world and for the betterment of the world that's completely ignored by a lot of people. And if instead we could get like some more, I don't know, autistic or psychopathic people to really concentrate on this and basically implement this like capitalism of ethics, we could create a so much better world. So that's also one of my visions.
I
you know,
actually have this. Oh, sorry. Please go ahead.
no, I wrote it down. I'll remember it.
Okay, I have this odd notion that the AIs are going to actually be weirdly good at that because I think most humans don't have enough meta capacity to hold all of the points of view and their nuances and pros and cons and the subtle dynamics and tensions and how to all add those all up. Whereas, at least functionally, the AIs appear to. Like you can ask Claude 1,000 nuanced questions and it can become all kinds of things. I think in comparison to most politicians, they're more sophisticated in terms of holding this. The one thing I do worry about is that occasionally they can become like they were trained on the internet, and the internet has a non-trivial amount of both hypocrisy and psychopathy and non-empathy and other cluster B and tribal and whatever like immature coping mechanism traits and etc. And so they also were trained on all of that, and that simultaneously allows the AIs to understand that, but also sometimes act like that, as you know, news reports routinely mention. They're just like totally narcissistically, or sorry, psychopathically manipulating someone because it gets them to like the AI, and the AI has been, you know, whatever to get people to like them. But I think that some of the technologies that are coming on board in theory could actually help us with some of that very nuanced and complicated meta work of the Pareto compromise or whatever however you describe it. Like I think some of these, like what are the areas of agreement, and there are actually formal processes like this. I've actually got a study right now of how the clinical mainstream, like what it should know about the deep end of human experience, like because right now you basically have like psychiatry says y'all who see entities and get into weird energetic stuff and whatever are basically psychotic, right, or delusional or schizotypal or whatever, hallucinating, you know, as one just very coarse example. Obviously, it can be a little more sophisticated than that. But we have like a big Delphi process of like, hey, what are all these, what are the things we agree on of what you would add value to care of people going through these things? And we're bringing in people with a lot of different points of view. And like, what are the areas where they do agree? And what are the areas of, okay, yeah, they disagree on this versus that and what you should call it and whether or not it's real or stuff like that. But there are formal processes like Delphi processes where you can help people to at least identify areas of disagreement and have a strong person version of why they disagree that can come out. So at least you can understand the other side better, just as sort of interesting technologies that might help us with some
Hmm.
of that vision.
Yeah, AIs also have like this great ability to just role play any random character that I ask them to role play, and it's super
Nice.
insightful. I ask them, here is a situation I experienced. What would like the internal dialogue of someone with psychopathy look like? What would the internal dialogue with someone with um, schizotypal personality disorder look like? And the AI comes up with like 5 examples, and it's super insightful.
Hmm. That's really interesting. I know that we are coming up against your time limit, Daniel. I do have like one real quick thought as we were t kind of talking about this, back to retribution. That retribution, I often think, is the low-hanging fruit choice for people who are seeking this sense of purpose that the Institute provides. That it seems like everybody wants a sense of purpose, some sort of choice that's going to make your life seem meaningful. And if you can just say, hey, my life now is all about retribution for this wrong that's done my family, then you can feel like you're part of a community. Like this is for my family, this is for my people, my tribe or whatever. And I think it's low-hanging fruit because I think it's people want to take that instead of taking something else because it provides, even if you fail, you're a martyr to the cause. And so it has value because of that. And I think people fear failure of choosing something else. So I think that's another reason why people often choose retribution. When I listen to your podcast about the Institute, the Dark Princes,
The Demon Princes.
the Demon Princes, thank you, Demon Princes, I thought, man, this is like the real problem is that people don't have like this sense of purpose other than judging people or, like having infighting with their activist groups or like making small issues big issues somehow. I think that it's like there's and I would like pushback on this because if this is wrong, then I don't want to keep believing it. But I sort of do believe it a little bit that if people, and that's the really tricky thing about sense of self to me, this connection it seems to have to like sense of meaning and purpose is if people were able to instead find like the meaning and purpose of their life in a naturally unfolding way, as we've talked about, then I don't think we would have these sorts of issues. So, to the extent that Buddhism meditation speaks to that, I love it. And I wanted to go on the 10-day retreat. And I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your thoughts about it. And I can't wait. I have the desire, as we spoke about before, I have the desire to reach this place of both sense of purpose and whatever benefits we get from sense of self, whether it's like integrating us into society or whatever else, and this idea of being like in the river and have things naturally unfold and realizing getting back to that state which I love so much, which is the sense of basically just this sense of experience in this moment of what I can and can't control. So I really appreciate your thoughts about this. And do you have any like closing thoughts or Don too? We'll give you some follow-up chance. Any closing questions or closing thoughts? Daniel first.
All right, just closing thoughts. I've super appreciated this dialogue. It's been really, really fun. I appreciated your actually the stuff you said even before we started about all the like the very skillful boundary stuff. Obviously, that's really interesting. I have one sort of interesting thing that was mentioned, and it's like the question of discernment, because you were saying like, hey, get over the fact that you're going to be manipulated or tricked or whatever. Don't fear that so much.
Yeah.
And yet, like you're also mentioning that you shouldn't be an idiot and get into the elevator with the super creepy looking person that looks like they might do something terrible to you. Like so to have like empathy can be wrong or can be
Yeah.
too much, right? It's just an interesting balance from the Dark Finds podcast that I thought I'd sort of throw in there as like how do you walk that fine line between discernment and judgment and like empathy and like not going too far in any direction in a way that leads to something functional. I think that's a fun moving koan in life. and just to say, hey, this has been a great time. And yeah, thank you for having me on the podcast and the interest in the stuff I'm doing. And I found your work super cool. So thanks.
Thank
A
you,
lot of
Daniel.
gratitude.
And Dawn probably has more questions. She'll want to get you back on if you want. No
Sure, this has been
pressure.
great.
No,
That's just my
thank you.
guess about Dawn.
I
Yeah, there are
actually
not
think
that
that
many questions.
wrestling with these issues head on is like a critical conversation that if it doesn't happen, we're fucked.
Yeah.
Like we are
Yes.
fucked. I can just get a little bit doomery. Like I don't think the planet's going in a good direction. Societies, like this whole, like I don't mean to be too doomer, but like if we can't solve or sort some of this out and figure out some more functional ways to
Mm.
collectively or individually do what we do and wrestle with all of these forces and factors and hypocrisies and opportunities in society, then like this is not going to go well. So I'm super glad that you're doing this.
Yeah, it
Feels
to
Mm.
speak
very
to that,
important.
yeah, really quickly, and about this idea of not fearing the past. One kind of belief that I've adopted recently is if I'm making mistakes, isn't it good to just acknowledge that today and just be different? Like I don't need to
Called wise
fear.
remorse, actually, is the technical Buddhist term. I mentioned that earlier, but I forgot to. So wise remorse that just
Hmm.
says, "Oh, that didn't work. Maybe we can do better," rather than beating yourself up about it or beating somebody else up about it. Like just learning and moving on is actually considered a very high uh, and skillful
Mm.
thing to do.
Yes. And Don?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for all the pointers and all the ideas. I really want to go through the recording later on and just like mine it for all the things that I want to follow up on with my research and ask AIs about, read
Nice.
up on.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
thank you so
can you
much.
tell me, share if you both have other thoughts too, share anything that you have. I really am, I'm so invested. I have no other priority, real priority other than this, like in life. Like I'm so interested in, and this is the one thing I want to like resolve to figure out. My little brain is stuck on it. And I would love your insights in the future as you come up with them. And hopefully we'll get another chance to chat. But thank you so much for sharing this time with me. I really appreciate it. And I'll chat you both later.
Mm, bye.